Hello and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. Before we get started, it would be great to know where in the world you are listening from. Leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy these calm, curious journeys through science, please subscribe and like the video. It really helps the channel. And to everyone already subscribed, thank you. Your support is very much appreciated. Tonight's subject is the moon, which most people know as the thing that causes the tides. A useful start, but not nearly the full story. Because the moon has been quietly shaping far more than the oceans. It has influenced the length of Earth's day, the stability of the planet's tilt, the behaviour of living things, and the long history of the world itself. Not bad for something that mostly just hangs there looking decorative. So the real question is not whether the moon affects Earth. It very clearly does. The more interesting question is how far that influence really goes, and what kind of world this planet would be if that calm, bright companion had never been there at all. The moon is so familiar that it can begin to feel almost harmless. It hangs above cities, fields, rooftops, and sleeping oceans with such quiet consistency that it is easy to mistake it for background scenery, as if it were simply part of the wallpaper of the night. It has been painted, worshipped, written about, sighed at, blamed for odd behaviour, and given a remarkable amount of poetic responsibility over the centuries. It has lit roads, guided sailors, and stared down at campfires, kingdoms, telescopes, and apartment blocks with the same pale face. For most people, it belongs to that category of things which are always there and therefore rarely questioned too deeply. And yet the moon is not merely there. It does things. That is the important shift. The moon is not just a bright object in the sky. It is part of an active physical relationship, one that has been shaping this planet for an astonishingly long time. The familiar story says that it causes the tides, which is true, but also incomplete in a way that almost feels unfair to the moon. Because the sea is only the most visible place where its influence can be noticed. Its reach extends much farther than the rise and fall of coastal water. It touches motion, time, stability, coastlines, ecosystems, and the long environmental history of Earth itself. That may sound slightly grand for something that often looks like a decorative lantern, but the science is unambiguous. Earth and the moon are partners in a gravitational system. Not equal partners, perhaps, because Earth is much larger and more massive, but partners all the same. The relationship is not symbolic. It is mechanical, measurable, and continuous. Every second, each body pulls on the other. Every second, both respond. This is where gravity enters properly, not as a vague idea of things falling down, but as a universal interaction between masses. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton gave this idea its most powerful early form. His law of universal gravitation described a simple and revolutionary fact. Every mass attracts every other mass. That meant the force pulling an apple toward Earth, and the force keeping the moon in its path around Earth, belonged to the same underlying principle. The heavens and the everyday world were no longer separate realms operating by different rules. The moon was not gliding through some privileged celestial perfection. It was obeying physics. That realization changed everything. It turned the moon from a distant mystery into something that could be understood as part of the same natural order as tides, falling stones, and moving planets. It also revealed something quietly profound about the Earth-Moon relationship. The moon is not circling Earth because it is somehow tied to it by invisible string, nor because it has chosen loyalty after all these billions of years. It is moving forward through space while constantly being pulled sideways by Earth's gravity. The result is an orbit, a kind of endless falling that never quite reaches the ground. But even that familiar picture can be refined. It is tempting to imagine Earth sitting still, while the moon loops obediently around it like a child circling a maypole. The real arrangement is subtler. Earth and the Moon both orbit a shared centre of mass, often called the barycenter. Because Earth is much more massive, that shared centre lies inside Earth rather than out, in space between the two bodies. Even so, it means the Moon does not simply go around Earth while Earth does nothing. Both bodies move around a common point. Even here, the relationship is mutual. The scale of that system is worth pausing over, because it helps explain why the Moon matters so much. The Moon is not a tiny pebble tagging along behind a giant planet. It is large relative to Earth. Unusually large in fact when compared with the moons of many other rocky worlds. Its diameter is about 1/4 of Earth's. Its average distance from Earth is about 384,000 kilometers, far enough to feel remote, yet close enough for its gravitational pull to have powerful and lasting consequences. It is smaller than Earth, certainly, and much less massive, but it is not negligible. It is a serious companion. That closeness matters. Gravity weakens with distance, and the Moon is near enough for its pull to produce effects that are not merely theoretical. The most familiar is the tide, of course, the slow breathing of the sea along the world's shorelines. But even before getting into the water itself, the important idea is that Earth is not isolated. It is being acted upon. The planet is not simply spinning in solitude beneath a decorative night lamp. It is part of a two-body system in motion, with constant exchanges of force and energy shaping what happens here below. There is something almost funny about how easy it is to miss this. People look at the Moon and see stillness. Science looks at the same object and sees interaction. The pale disk above the horizon can seem calm to the point of passivity, and yet its presence has consequences that accumulate over immense lengths of time. Some of those consequences are immediate, like changing water levels along a coast. Others are so slow that they disappear beneath the rhythm of human life, and only become obvious through geology, astronomy, and careful measurement. But slow does not mean weak. In planetary history, slow processes often have the final word. This is part of what makes the Moon so quietly extraordinary. It does not need drama to be important. It does not erupt, blaze, or roar. It simply keeps pulling. Night after night, century after century, age after age, it remains locked in this gravitational partnership with Earth, and the effect spread outward through the planet's systems. The motion of the oceans responds, the shape of coastlines responds, the timing of living things responds, even the length of a day and the long steadiness of Earth's posture in space are part of the same deeper story. That story begins with something simple enough to fit in a sentence. The Moon pulls on Earth, and Earth pulls on the Moon. But simplicity at the beginning does not mean simplicity at the end. Once that first principle is accepted, the rest unfolds almost inevitably. A force becomes a rhythm. A rhythm becomes a pattern. A pattern, repeated across millions and billions of years, becomes part of the architecture of the world. So the Moon is not just a light. It is not just a clock for poets, a companion for insomniacs, or a useful excuse for wolves in fiction. It is a gravitational presence woven into the physical life of this planet. The familiar brightness in the sky hides a deeper reality, one that stretches from visible moonlight to invisible forces, from folklore to measurement, from the surface of the sea to the motion of the Earth itself. And once that is seen clearly, the Moon becomes harder to dismiss as scenery ever again. If the Moon pulled on every part of Earth equally, the oceans would not rise and fall in the way they do. That is the first important thing to understand. Tides not caused simply by the Moon tugging on the planet as a whole, as though Earth were a bucket of water being dragged gently through space. If that were the case, Earth and its oceans would just move together. There would be no great swelling of the sea on one side, no answering bulge on the other, and no steady rhythm of coastlines filling and emptying. The real story is more delicate than that. It depends on difference. Gravity weakens with distance. That sounds almost too obvious to be interesting, but here it does nearly all the work. The side of Earth facing the Moon is slightly closer to the Moon than Earth's centre is, and Earth's centre is slightly closer than the far side. Since the Moon's pull is stronger at shorter distances and weaker at longer ones, different parts of Earth feel slightly different amounts of gravitational force. That uneven pull is what matters. It is called tidal force, and it is the true engine behind the tides. This means the Moon is not merely pulling on Earth, it is pulling on one side of Earth a little more strongly than on the middle, and on the middle a little more strongly than on the far side. The difference is small, but Earth is large, the oceans are mobile, and small differences repeated endlessly can do a great deal. In planetary science, subtle does not mean unimportant. It often means patient. The nearer side of Earth feels the strongest pull toward the Moon. Water there is drawn slightly more strongly than the solid body of the planet beneath it, so the ocean is stretched outward, creating a broad bulge on the side facing the Moon. That part is often easy enough to picture. It fits the ordinary intuition that the Moon pulls the sea toward itself. But then comes the part that tends to make people pause, because there is also a second bulge on the far side of Earth, the side turned away from the Moon. At first glance, this can seem absurd, as though the ocean has decided to be politely symmetrical. But the physics is real, and the explanation is elegant. Earth and the Moon do not sit still while one pulls on the other. They both orbit a shared centre of mass, the barycenter, as part of the same moving system. Earth is much larger, so this shared point lies inside Earth, but not at its exact centre. As Earth moves around this barycenter, every part of the planet experiences the same overall tendency associated with that motion. The key is that the Moon's direct gravitational pull is not equally strong everywhere, while the shared orbital motion of the Earth-Moon system is treated, in this simplified view, as common across Earth. On the near side, the Moon's pull is stronger than this common motion alone would imply, so water bulges outward toward the Moon. On the far side, the Moon's pull is weaker than that common motion, so the water there is left slightly behind relative to the solid Earth, producing another bulge away from the Moon. A less formal way to picture it is to imagine Earth being gently stretched along the line pointing toward and away from the Moon. The planet is, in effect, pulled into a slightly elongated shape. The oceans respond more readily than the solid Earth does, so the stretching becomes especially noticeable in the water. Not as towering walls racing around the globe, of course. The word bulge can sound far more dramatic than reality. These are broad, shallow distortions spread across vast regions of ocean, not aquatic mountains waiting to terrify passing ships. So there are two main tidal bulges, one facing the Moon and one opposite it. If Earth didn't rotate, many places would simply remain under one part of this stretched shape. But Earth does rotate, and that changes everything from the point of view of anyone standing on a shoreline. As the planet spins, coastlines move through these bulges. A given location is carried into a region where the sea is slightly raised, then out of it again, then toward the other bulge, and away once more. The result is the familiar cycle of rising and falling water levels. In many coastal places, this produces roughly 2 high tides and 2 low tides in about a lunar day, though the real world, being the real world, often resists neat simplification. This is why tides are not best imagined as water sloshing from one side of the planet to the other in some giant planetary bathtub. They are better understood as Earth rotating beneath a gravitational pattern created by differences in the Moon's pull. The sea level at any coast changes because that coast is moving relative to these tidal bulges, while the oceans themselves are also responding dynamically to basin shape, seafloor depth, continental boundaries, and the Coriolis effect produced by Earth's rotation. The tidy picture of two bulges is the foundation, but actual oceans take that foundation and make it gloriously complicated. This point became much clearer as the mathematics of tides developed. Isaac Newton laid the groundwork by identifying universal gravitation, but later thinkers pushed further into the difficult business of describing how real fluids respond to celestial forcing. Pierre-Simon Laplace was one of the most important of these figures. He helped build the mathematical treatment of tides into the larger framework of celestial mechanics, showing that the motions of oceans, planets, and moons could be studied with the same rigorous physical language. Tides were no longer merely coastal curiosities or sailors' concerns. They became part of the grand clockwork of the solar system, though admittedly a rather wet and temperamental part of it. And there is one more important quiet complication. The moon is the dominant cause of the tides, but it is not acting alone. The sun also raises tides on Earth. Despite being enormously more massive, the sun is much farther away, so its tidal effect is weaker than the moon's, though still substantial. That means Earth's tides are really the product of at least two major gravitational influences layered together. The moon leads the dance, but the sun is very much on the floor as well. This will matter more later when the alignment of sun, moon, and Earth changes the strength of the tides, but even here it is worth noting that the sea is responding to a system, not a single isolated tug. What makes tides so fascinating is that they depend on variation rather than simple pull. That is the real conceptual shift. If gravity acted uniformly across Earth, tides as we know them would not exist. The oceans would move with the planet, and that would be that. Instead, because Earth has size, because the moon has distance, and because gravity changes from one side of the planet to the other, the sea is stretched into rhythm. The effect is not about attraction alone. It is about unequal attraction across space. And that idea turns out to be far more powerful than it first appears. Once variation in gravitational pull is allowed to matter, a whole chain of consequences begins to unfold. The oceans respond first and most visibly, but they are not the only part of Earth that notices. The same logic that raises tides in water reaches into the deeper mechanics of the Earth-Moon system itself. What begins as a slight difference in force across one planet becomes, given enough time, a force that shapes motion, coastlines, and eventually even timekeeping on a planetary scale. So the tide is not simply the sea being pulled upward by the moon like a curtain on a string. It is Earth being stretched by a difference in gravity. It is a planet responding to uneven force, and from that quiet inequality, the regular breathing of the coast begins. Along the edge of the sea, the moon becomes easier to believe in. Out in the open ocean, its pull is broad and patient, stretching water across immense distances with very little interest in human convenience. But along a coastline, the effect becomes visible in ordinary, tangible ways. A harbour that seemed comfortably full a few hours ago can sit lower and quieter by afternoon. Mudflats emerge where water once covered everything in a single grey sheet. Estuaries narrow and widen. Salt marshes glisten, then darken, then flood again. Boats lean awkwardly in places where they had floated freely before. The sea does not simply sit still and wait for attention. It moves in and out, advances and retreats, and in doing so gives the impression that the planet itself is breathing. That daily breathing is one of the most familiar expressions of the moon's influence, though even here familiarity can be misleading. It is tempting to imagine tides as a tidy global mechanism, almost clockwork in its simplicity, with the water rising and falling in the same graceful way everywhere. The underlying physics may be elegant, but the actual ocean is gloriously less cooperative. Once the moon's tidal force meets the real Earth, with its continents, shelves, islands, narrowing channels, uneven depths, and rotating basins, the neat picture begins to wrinkle. This is why one coastline can experience dramatic tides while another sees only modest changes. The moon provides the forcing, but geography decides how that forcing is expressed. The shape of a coast matters. The depth of the water matters. The width of a bay matters. The slope of the continental shelf matters. Even the natural oscillation of a basin matters, because some bodies of water are more ready than others to respond strongly to a repeating push. A tide is never just a lunar event. It is a conversation between celestial mechanics and local geography. In a broad sense, the moon raises tidal bulges in the global ocean, but the ocean is not free to behave like a perfect, smooth shell. Continents interrupt the flow. Water is channeled, delayed, redirected, and sometimes amplified. The turning of Earth introduces the Coriolis effect, which bends moving water and helps create rotating tidal systems in ocean basins. Friction with the seafloor slows things down. Narrow inlets can concentrate flow. Shallow water can force a tide to pile higher than it otherwise would. The result is that no two coastlines tell exactly the same tidal story. Some places barely murmur, others make a performance of it. One of the most striking examples is the Bay of Fundy, between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia in Canada. There, the range between low tide and high tide can become enormous, among the largest on Earth. This is not because the moon suddenly becomes extra enthusiastic over eastern Canada. It is because the bay has a shape and size that allow the incoming tidal wave to resonate. In simple terms, the water in the bay sloshes back and forth with a natural timing that happens to match the rhythm of the tides unusually well. When the external push and the basin's own response line up in this way, the water builds. The result is a coastal landscape where the moon's gentle pull is transformed into something bold and unmistakable. It is one of the clearest reminders that local conditions can magnify a universal force into something almost theatrical. Elsewhere, the expression is quieter but no less real. In estuaries, the meeting places of river and sea, tides can reverse currents, carry salt inland, and control the flooding and draining of marshes. In tidal flats, whole feeding grounds appear and vanish on a schedule not written by the sun alone. In narrow channels, tidal currents can race with surprising power, creating whirlpools, eddies, and dangerous passages for vessels that misjudge the timing. In harbours, quay walls and mooring lines become part of the daily evidence that the sea is never in quite the same place for long. Even a casual walker on a beach can watch the boundary between land and water shift over the course of an afternoon and, without realizing it, watch celestial mechanics translated into wet sand. This is where the moon's influence stops feeling abstract. Gravitational differences across Earth diameter may be the true cause of tides, but harbours, mudflats, exposed rocks, and retreating shorelines are how that cause enters ordinary experience. The science becomes visible in tide marks on stone, in boats resting on their sides, in shellfish beds uncovered to the air, in coastal birds following the waterline as it creeps away. The moon is still far above, but its effects are underfoot. It is also worth remembering that the ideal picture of two tidal bulges is only a starting point. Real oceans do not rise and fall everywhere in perfect synchrony. In some places there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides in roughly a day. In others, one high tide may dominate. In still others, the pattern shifts from place to place through the month. Oceanographers describe these differences using terms such as semidiurnal, diurnal, and mixed tides, though the important thing is not the vocabulary, but the reminder that the moon provides a rhythm which Earth's varied coastlines then interpret in different ways. Modern oceanography has made this complexity measurable in extraordinary detail. Institutions such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration monitor sea level, chart tidal stations, and help predict local tides with remarkable accuracy. This work matters for shipping, fisheries, flood forecasting, coastal engineering, habitat research, and public safety. It also quietly confirms something rather lovely about science. A force that begins with the motion of a distant natural satellite can be tracked all the way down to the timing of water under a specific pier on a specific morning. The path from the moon to a harbour wall is long, but it is real. There is a useful humility in this. The ocean is not a passive sheet waiting to be lifted. It is a dynamic system, full of inertia, friction, resonance, rotation, and regional character. The moon provides the forcing, but the sea answers in its own voice. Sometimes that voice is subtle, a gentle rise against a harbour step. Sometimes it is dramatic, exposing vast reaches of seabed or surging through a narrowing channel with startling speed. In every case, what is being witnessed is the same basic principle meeting different physical circumstances, and that is what makes tides so much richer than the simplified version first learned in childhood. The moon does not just tug water upward in some single, universal gesture. It sets the ocean in motion through uneven gravitational pull, and then the planet's actual shape, depth, and rotation turn that clean principle into a wildly varied global phenomenon. The daily breathing of the sea is therefore both simple and complicated at once. Simple in cause, complicated in expression. The moon supplies the rhythm. Earth supplies the coastline. The ocean, caught between them, performs the result. There's another quiet layer to the tide story, and it arrives each month whether anyone pays attention to it or not. The sea does not simply rise and fall with one steady level of strength all the time. Some tides are larger, spreading farther up beaches, climbing higher against harbour walls, and draining more dramatically away. Others are gentler, with a smaller difference between high water and low water. The moon remains the main reason tides exist at all, but the sun joins the process as well, and together they create a slow, monthly change in the size of the tide itself. This is where the familiar phases of the moon begin to matter in a more practical way. A full moon is not merely a bright night. A new moon is not merely a dark one. Both are moments of alignment, and alignment changes how gravitational forces combine. When the sun, earth, and moon lie in roughly a straight line, the lunar tide and the solar tide reinforce one another. The combined effect produces a larger tidal range, with higher high tides and lower low tides. These are called spring tides. The name causes confusion with impressive reliability. Spring tides have nothing to do with the season of spring. They can happen in any month of the year. The word comes from the older sense of springing upward, rising or leaping forth. It is a wonderfully energetic name for a process that usually arrives with all the visible drama of water very slowly climbing some steps. Still, the meaning is useful. A spring tide is a stronger tide, one in which the sea seems to stretch a little farther between its extremes. This happens during the new moon and the full moon. At new moon, the moon is positioned roughly between Earth and the sun. At full moon, Earth lies roughly between the moon and the sun. In both cases, the three bodies are aligned in a way that allows their tidal effects to work in the same general direction. The moon is still the dominant driver, because tidal force depends strongly on distance, and the moon is far closer than the sun, but the sun adds enough to make the result clearly different. Then, about a week later, the geometry changes. The moon reaches first quarter or last quarter, and from Earth, the sun and moon appear separated by roughly a right angle in the sky. In that arrangement, the solar tide and lunar tide no longer reinforce each other so neatly. Instead, they partly counteract one another. The tidal range becomes smaller. High tides are not quite as high, low tides are not quite as low, and the sea seems a little less ambitious. These are called neap tides, so the monthly rhythm of tides is really a rhythm of partnership. The moon leads, the sun modifies, Earth rotates through the combined pattern. The coastline notices the difference. If a more formal term is wanted, astronomers use the word syzygy for the straight-line arrangement of the sun, earth and moon. It sounds rather grand, as though it ought to arrive wearing a velvet cloak and carrying a brass instrument. But the meaning is simple enough. It refers to alignment. New moon and full moon are the usual tidal moments of syzygy, and these are the times associated with spring tides. By contrast, when the moon and sun appear at right angles from Earth perspective, the arrangement is sometimes described as quadrature. That simply means the geometry is working differently, and the tides become neap tides instead. The terms are useful, though the sea manages perfectly well without pronouncing either of them. Long before the physics was understood, people living near coasts noticed these patterns. Fishing communities, sailors, harbour workers, and coastal traders did not need Newton or Laplace to tell them that some tides ran higher than others, and that the cycle was linked to the moon. Ancient observers in many parts of the world tracked lunar phases closely, because practical life often demanded it. A strong tide could help float a vessel over a shallow bar, fill a harbour basin, flood a tidal flat or expose one. A weaker tide might leave different channels navigable, alter fishing conditions or change the timing of work along the shore. Knowledge of the moon was never only poetic. Quite often it was logistical. That practical importance remains. Ports still account for spring and neap cycles. Coastal planners still study tidal ranges when assessing flood risk, erosion, and infrastructure. Fishers and shellfish gatherers still pay close attention to the timing and height of the water. In estuaries and shallow coastal regions, the difference between a spring tide and a neap tide can change how far salt water moves inland, how strongly tidal currents run, and which mudflats or marsh edges are exposed. The moon may seem remote in the sky, but in these moments it is busy scheduling the coastline. There is something satisfying in the way this connects the sky to such ordinary earthly details. A person watching the full moonrise might think first about light, about beauty, or perhaps about sleep being slightly harder to negotiate with a bright window. Meanwhile, along a coast somewhere, the same alignment is helping decide how high the water will reach against a harbour ladder, when a boat can safely depart, or whether a sandbank will sit hidden or exposed. Celestial mechanics can be strangely domestic when given the chance. This monthly changing range also helps reveal that the moon's influence is more than a simple up and down pulse. The tide is not one fixed action repeated forever with perfect sameness. It is a dynamic pattern shaped by geometry, timing, and partnership. The moon does not merely raise the sea twice each day and call the matter finished. Its relationship with the sun alters the scale of that motion, and the repeating sequence of lunar phases becomes a visible clock for changes in the water itself. It is also another reminder that the sea responds to more than a single isolated cause. Even with the moon as the main actor, the Earth-Moon system exists within the larger gravity of the solar system. The sun contributes enough to matter, and because the positions of the sun and moon relative to Earth shift in a regular cycle, the tides inherit that cycle too. The result is a layered rhythm. Daily change sits inside monthly change. Local geography adds another layer on top. The sea, as usual, refuses to behave like a one-sentence summary. And so, the moon's control over tides begins to look broader even before moving beyond the ocean. It controls not only the existence of tides, but the changing strength of tides through the month. It links familiar moon phases to measurable shifts in coastal water level. It shapes navigation, work, planning, and life along shorelines in ways that human beings have noticed for thousands of years. Even at this stage, before the story reaches Earth's rotation or climate stability or the history of life, the moon has already done more than simply lift the sea. It has imposed rhythm, variation and timing on the edge of the world. The water answers not just to the moon alone, but to the moon in conversation with the sun. And each month, without hurry and without fail, that conversation leaves its mark on every coast. By now the moon has already done quite a lot. It has raised the oceans, shaped the daily movement of coastlines, and worked with the sun to alter the strength of tides through the month. That would be enough to earn a respectable place in Earth's story. But the moon is not finished there, because the sea is not the only thing that responds to its pull. The solid Earth responds as well. This is one of those ideas that sounds faintly unreasonable at first. Water moving under gravity feels natural enough. Water is supposed to move. It sloshes, flows, spills, freezes, evaporates, and generally behaves like a substance with very few long-term commitments. Rock, by contrast, seems built around the concept of refusal. Mountains do not wobble. Pavements do not rise and fall with the phases of the moon. A cliff face does not usually inspire the thought that it is participating in celestial mechanics, and yet, in a quiet and measurable way, the solid Earth does move under lunar gravity. It flexes. These are called Earth tides, or body tides. They are produced by the same basic principle as ocean tides, the moons. Gravity is slightly stronger on the side of Earth nearest to it and slightly weaker on the far side. That uneven pull stretches the planet very slightly along the Earth-Moon line. The crust and upper mantle deform in response, not dramatically, and certainly not in any way that would send furniture drifting across the room, but enough that the ground itself rises and falls by small amounts over the course of the tidal cycle. This does not happen because rock has suddenly become liquid. It happens because rock, over large enough scales and under persistent force, is not perfectly rigid. That is an important scientific truth that everyday life does not advertise very clearly. The materials making up Earth's crust and mantle are strong, but they are not infinitely stiff. Given a changing gravitational pull, they can bend, compress, and relax by tiny amounts. The planet is solid in the ordinary human sense, but not mechanically immovable. In geophysics, solidity is not the same thing as absolute resistance. The amount of this deformation is much smaller and much harder to notice than the rise and fall of the sea, but it is not trivial. In some places, the solid Earth can move vertically by several tens of centimeters over a tidal cycle. That sounds almost impolite of the planet, though it happens so smoothly and over such broad regions that human beings do not feel it. There is no sense of the ground swelling beneath one's feet. No gentle lunar bounce interrupts a quiet walk. The motion is too gradual, too distributed, and too buried beneath the noise of everyday movement to be perceived directly. But instruments can detect it, and once detected, it becomes another clear sign that the moon acts on the whole planet, not just on the oceans. This is where geodesy becomes important. Geodesy is the science of measuring Earth's shape, size, position, and gravitational field with extraordinary precision. It is one of those fields that sounds slightly austere until its usefulness becomes clear, at which point it begins to seem quietly heroic. Through geodetic methods, scientists can detect minute shifts in the surface of Earth, including those caused by lunar and solar tides. With tools such as very precise satellite positioning, laser ranging, gravimeters and strain meters, motions far below normal human perception become measurable and meaningful. That is one of the more beautiful habits of science. It reveals that the absence of sensation is not the same thing as the absence of motion. A person can stand on seemingly motionless ground, while that ground is in fact rising, falling, stretching, and relaxing as part of a planetary rhythm driven by the moon. The silence of the process makes it no less real. Quite the opposite. It makes the discovery feel a little more profound. Institutions that study Earth deformation and crustal motion, such as the United States Geological Survey, and similar geophysical organizations around the world, treat these subtle movements as important signals. Earth tides must often be accounted for when interpreting sensitive measurements of seismic activity, groundwater pressure, crustal strain, and volcanic systems. If the planet is already moving slightly under the pull of the moon, that background movement has to be understood before other changes can be interpreted properly. In this way, the moon becomes part of the baseline behavior of Earth itself. It is folded into the normal rhythm against which other geophysical events are measured. There is also something quietly clarifying in this. People often imagine tides as a special property of water, as though the moon and the sea had entered into some private arrangement that left the rest of the planet uninvolved. But tides are not really about water at all, at least not at the most fundamental level. They are about differential gravity acting across an extended body. Water responds visibly because it flows easily. Rock responds more subtly because it resists more strongly. But both are participating in the same physical process. The moon is not choosing the ocean over the continents. It is acting on Earth as a whole. The oceans merely make the effect easier to watch. That broader view deepens the meaning of lunar influence. The moon is not simply rearranging coastlines and harbour depths. It is exerting stress across the crust, tugging gently on mountains, plains, seabeds, and bedrock. The ground beneath every city, desert, forest, and field is part of this relationship. It rises and falls by tiny amounts in a rhythm few people ever notice, though it has been happening for as long as the Earth-Moon system has existed in anything like its present form. There is something rather humbling in that thought. The planet is less still than it seems. It also helps explain why the title of this story must reach beyond the sea. If the moon affected only tides in the ordinary coastal sense, it would still be important. But the truth is broader. Lunar gravity deforms the oceans and the land together, each according to its own mechanical nature. The moon's action is planetary rather than merely maritime. It reaches into the structure of Earth itself, and yet, as with so many things involving the moon, the scale of the effect invites restraint rather than drama. Earth tides do not crack continents open on a schedule. They do not trigger catastrophe simply by existing. Their importance lies in what they reveal. They show that even the hardest parts of Earth are not beyond the reach of celestial influence. They show that rigidity is relative, that a planet can flex without announcing it, and that a force patient enough and regular enough can leave its mark on more than the eye alone would ever suspect. The visible tide at a shoreline is only the most public version of a deeper truth. Under the same lunar pull, the oceans shift, the coastlines respond, and even the stone of the planet yields slightly. The moon does not stop at the water's edge. It keeps going, through the crust, through the body of Earth, through the whole quiet architecture of the world. Up to this point, the moon has acted like a patient sculptor of cycles. It has raised the sea, altered the strength of the tides through the month, and even flexed the solid Earth by small but measurable amounts. All of that is impressive enough, but there is a deeper consequence hidden inside the tides, and it may be the most extraordinary one so far. The moon is not only shaping repeating patterns on Earth, it is also changing the length of the day. That sounds almost unreasonably grand, as though the moon had somehow taken charge of time itself. In a sense, over geological history it has. Not by magic and not by doing anything sudden, but through a slow, physical process called tidal friction. The basic setup begins with an imbalance in timing. Earth rotates faster than the Moon orbits Earth. In other words, the planet spins on its axis in less time than the Moon takes to move around it. Because of that, the tidal bulges raised by the Moon are not kept perfectly lined up with the Earth-Moon line. Earth's rotation drags them slightly ahead. This matters because the oceans are not frictionless. Water moves across sea floors, around continental edges, through shallow seas and against coastlines. Energy is dissipated in that motion. The tides do not glide around the planet like perfectly obedient mathematical ideas. They rub, churn, and resist. The result is that the tidal bulges end up offset a little in the direction Earth is rotating. So instead of the largest bulges pointing exactly toward and directly away from the Moon, they're carried slightly ahead of that line. The Moon, in turn, feels the gravitational pull of those displaced bulges, and because the bulges are not perfectly aligned, that pull has a sideways component. This creates a torque. Torque is the rotational version of a push. If a straight push changes motion in a line, a torque changes motion in a spin. A door opens because a force is applied at a distance from its hinges. A spinning system changes because a torque acts on it. In the Earth-Moon system, the tidal bulges act a little like gravitational handles, and the Moon pulls on them in a way that gradually alters both Earth's rotation and the Moon's orbit. To understand what is being transferred, it helps to introduce angular momentum. Angular momentum is the quantity associated with rotation and orbital motion. It depends on how much mass is moving, how fast it is moving, and how far from the centre of motion it is. A spinning skater pulling in their arms changes speed because angular momentum is being conserved. In the Earth-Moon system, angular momentum is not disappearing, it is being redistributed. Earth begins with rotational angular momentum because it is spinning. The Moon has orbital angular momentum because it is moving around Earth. Tidal friction allows some of Earth's rotational angular momentum to be passed to the Moon's orbit. The cost to Earth is that its spin slows down. The gain for the Moon is that its orbit changes. The important point here is that Earth is paying for this transfer with time itself, or at least with the length of the day. A day on Earth has not always been as long as it is now. In the distant past, Earth rotated more quickly. Days were shorter. The Moon's tidal braking has been slowing the planet's spin for immense stretches of time, adding small amounts to the length of the day over millions upon millions of years. In a human lifetime, this is too subtle to notice directly, but over geological history the effect is enormous. The ordinary 24-hour day, so familiar that it feels almost built into the nature of reality, is actually the current result of a very long mechanical negotiation between Earth and the Moon. There is something deeply strange about that. Morning, afternoon, evening, and night feel so basic that they seem beyond revision. But Earth's daily rhythm is not fixed in some eternal form. It has evolved. The Moon has helped rewrite it. This idea was studied in serious detail by George Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin, and an important figure in the history of tidal theory and the Earth-Moon system. He recognized that tides were not just local coastal phenomena, but part of a deeper long-term evolution involving rotation, orbit, and energy transfer. His work helped reveal that the Moon was not simply raising water and moving on. It was participating in the slow, dynamical history of the entire Earth-Moon partnership. What makes this especially satisfying is that the evidence does not rest only on theoretical physics. The shortening of days in the distant past is recorded in nature itself. Ancient tidal rhythmites, which are sedimentary layers laid down in repeating tidal patterns, preserve information about past tidal cycles. By studying these layered deposits, geologists can infer how many tidal cycles occurred within longer repeating periods. From that, they can reconstruct aspects of Earth's ancient rotation, Growth bands in some fossils tell a similar story. Certain corals, shell-forming organisms, and other life forms preserve daily and seasonal growth patterns in their hard structures. These patterns can sometimes reveal how many days occurred in a year long ago. Since the length of the year in orbital terms is not changing in the same way as Earth's daily rotation, a greater number of days in a year implies shorter days. The conclusion is clear. Hundreds of millions of years ago, a year contained more days than it does now, because each day was shorter. This is one of the loveliest moments in the whole story. The moon's effect on time is written both in physics and in stone. It appears in orbital mechanics, in tidal theory, in layered sediments, and in the growth records of long-dead organisms. A person can look at the present length of the day and mistake it for a constant. The Earth-Moon system knows better. The process itself remains wonderfully calm. Nothing dramatic is required. The tides move, friction acts, energy is dissipated, angular momentum is transferred. Earth spins a little more slowly, the change accumulates, that is all. Yet from that quiet repetition comes one of the grandest consequences in the whole relationship between Earth and the Moon. The sea, in other words, has been acting as a kind of planetary brake. Not a brake applied once, but one applied continuously and gently over deep time. The waters raised and dragged by the Moon have helped convert rotational energy into heat and orbital change. The coastlines notice this as tides. The planet notices it as a gradual slowing of its spin. Timekeeping, at least in the practical sense of how long a day lasts, is partly a tidal inheritance. This is the point where the Moon's role becomes much harder to dismiss as merely scenic or even merely coastal. The earlier chapters may have shown the Moon shaping water and subtly flexing rock, but here the scale shifts. The Moon is involved in the pacing of the Earth itself. The passage from sunrise to sunrise, the familiar turning of one day into the next, belongs to a history that has been modified by lunar gravity, and that changes the emotional weight of the whole subject. The Moon is no longer just the keeper of tides, it has entered the machinery of time, not in the abstract philosophical sense, and not as some mystical clock in the sky, but as a real physical partner whose pull has slowly altered the spin of the planet beneath every ocean, continent, forest, desert, and sleeping city. The day feels stable because human lives are short. The Earth-Moon system works on larger terms. Over those larger terms, the Moon has been quietly pressing its influence into the very length of Earth's turning, slowing the planet by degrees so small they vanish in a moment, but so persistent they reshape ages. If Earth is slowing down, something else in the system must be changing as well. That is the hidden balance inside the whole story of tidal friction. The Moon raises tides on Earth. Those tides are dragged slightly ahead by Earth's faster rotation, and the result is a gravitational torque that acts between the two bodies. Earth loses rotational energy and some of its rotational angular momentum. The Moon gains orbital energy and orbital angular momentum. And because of that exchange, the Moon is slowly moving farther away. This is one of the most elegant consequences in the Earth-Moon relationship. The slowing of Earth's spin and the recession of the Moon are not separate stories. They are the same story told from opposite sides. At first glance, it can sound a little odd. If Earth's gravity keeps the Moon in orbit, then why would the Moon move outward rather than inward? It is easy to assume that any object losing energy should spiral closer, like a satellite dropping through drag. But the Earth-Moon system is not behaving like that. The Moon is not falling inward because the transfer here is not a simple loss into emptiness. It is a redistribution within the system. Earth's rotation is giving up some of its stored motion, and the Moon's orbit is receiving it. The key idea is that the gravitational pull from the slightly offset tidal bulges does not just slow Earth down. It also gives the Moon a forward pull in its orbit. That extra forward pull increases the Moon's orbital energy. and in orbital mechanics, gaining energy at the moon's distance means moving into a larger orbit. So the moon gradually recedes. It is not escaping in any dramatic sense. It is not flying off into the dark in a fit of lunar independence. It remains firmly bound to Earth by gravity. But its average orbital distance is increasing very slowly. The moon of the distant future will orbit farther out than the moon of today, just as today's moon is farther away than the moon of the distant past. This does not happen because gravity is weakening. That is an important misunderstanding to avoid. Gravity is not fading like an old battery. The force remains what it is. What changes is the arrangement of energy and angular momentum in the Earth-Moon system. Earth's spin is being tapped, and the Moon's orbit is being enlarged by the transfer. The system evolves not because its laws are changing, but because those laws are acting continuously over immense stretches of time. For a long time this was understood in theory more clearly than it was measured directly. Then human beings, in one of their better moments, went to the moon and left behind tools that could help answer the question with extraordinary precision. During the Apollo missions, astronauts placed retroreflectors on the lunar surface. These are special arrays of mirrors designed to reflect incoming laser light back in the direction it came from. By bouncing laser pulses off these reflectors and measuring the travel time of the light, scientists can determine the Earth-Moon distance with remarkable accuracy. This technique is called lunar laser ranging, and it is one of the quiet triumphs of modern planetary science. A beam of light leaves Earth, crosses the enormous gap to the moon, reflects from equipment placed there by Apollo astronauts, and returns to detectors on Earth. From that round trip, the distance can be measured to astonishing precision. NASA and other research groups have used this method for decades, and the result confirms what tidal theory predicts. The moon is receding from Earth by about 3.8 centimeters per year. That is not much in a human sense. It is roughly the speed at which fingernails grow, which gives the process a slightly ridiculous dignity. One expects planetary evolution to arrive with more thunder than that. But over millions of years, such a rate becomes enormous. Over hundreds of millions of years, it changes the structure of the Earth-Moon relationship in ways that matter physically and historically, and those consequences are real. As the moon moves farther away, its tidal influence gradually weakens, because tidal force depends very strongly on distance. A more distant moon raises smaller tides. That means the tidal friction shaping Earth's rotation also changes over time. The whole process does not remain fixed. It evolves as the geometry evolves. The future of eclipses is also tied to this slow recession. Right now, the moon appears in the sky at almost exactly the right apparent size to cover the sun during a total solar eclipse. This is a coincidence of distance and scale, and it is temporary. As the moon recedes, it will appear slightly smaller in Earth's sky. Far enough into the future, it will no longer be able to cover the sun completely. Total solar eclipses will give way to annular eclipses, in which a ring of sunlight remains visible around the moon. One of the most dramatic sights in the sky turns out to have an expiration date. There is something wonderfully patient about all of this. The moon is moving away too slowly for any person to notice directly by looking up. The sea still rises. The full moon still looks familiar. Eclipses still occur. The world does not feel as though it is in the middle of orbital change, and yet it is. The Earth-Moon system is not frozen. It is quietly evolving, and it has been doing so for billions of years. That timescale matters. Human intuition is not built for changes this slow. A coastline changing between morning and evening makes sense because it can be watched. A planet losing a little rotational speed over millions of years, or a moon drifting outward by centimeters per year, feels too gradual to belong to ordinary experience. but planetary history is built out of exactly these patient accumulations. Tiny yearly changes become profound geological facts when given enough time. So the moon's recession is not an isolated curiosity. It is the outward expression of the same tidal physics that lengthens Earth's day. Earth slows, the moon recedes, one loses some rotational energy, the other gains orbital energy, one turns more slowly, the other moves farther out. These are not separate mechanisms, but two outcomes of the same ongoing transfer. This is why the moon's influence must be understood as dynamic rather than static. It is not simply sitting at a fixed distance, raising the same tides forever. It is in a long gravitational exchange with Earth, reshaping both bodies' motions through time. The familiar night sky hides a system still in motion, still adjusting, still carrying the consequences of tides far beyond the shoreline. And there is a certain quiet beauty in that. The moon that has already helped shape Earth's days and oceans is itself being reshaped in return, not in its rocky face or its cratered plains, but in the path it takes around the world. The relationship works both ways. Earth's tides pull back on the moon, and over ages the moon answers by slowly stepping farther into the dark. The present day, moon is receding from Earth by a tiny amount each year, and modern laser measurements can track that change with astonishing precision. But the real power of the story comes from realizing that it does not end with the modern age. The evidence does not begin with Apollo reflectors, observatories, or computers. It reaches far deeper into time. Long before human beings learned to bounce light off the moon, Earth had already been recording the changing length of its day in stone, in sediment, and in the layered growth of living things. This is where the story becomes especially satisfying, because an abstract piece of celestial mechanics turns into a readable history. The idea that Earth once spun faster might sound like the sort of claim that exists only inside equations, but nature has kept records of it. They are incomplete, scattered, and sometimes difficult to interpret, but taken together they tell a clear and consistent story. The day has not always been as long as it is now. The moon has helped to lengthen it. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from tidal rhythmites. These are sedimentary rock layers that preserve repeating patterns linked to tidal cycles. In places where ancient environments received regular pulses of fine sediment, the incoming and outgoing tides could leave behind delicate alternations in the layering. Over time, these daily, monthly and seasonal patterns became buried, compacted, and preserved in rock. They are not clocks in the ordinary sense, but they are records of rhythm, and rhythm can be counted. The remarkable thing about tidal rhythmites is that they sometimes preserve several cycles nested inside one another. A smaller repeating signal may reflect the daily tidal cycle. A larger modulation can reflect the changing strength of tides through the lunar month. Still broader patterns can connect to seasonal or annual changes. When geologists and sedimentologists study these layered records carefully, they can estimate how many daily tidal cycles occurred within a month, or how many days occurred within a year, at the time the sediments were laid down. That matters because the length of Earth's year in orbital terms does not change in the same way Earth's daily rotation does. If there were more days in a year in the distant past, then each day must have been shorter. So when tidal rhythmites suggest a greater number of daily cycles in ancient years, they point to a faster spinning Earth. This is not always easy work. Sedimentary records can be damaged, compressed, altered, or incomplete. Ancient coastlines are not always kind enough to preserve clean evidence for future geologists. And yet, despite the difficulties, some of these rhythmites provide striking support for the idea that Earth's spin has slowed over time. In certain Precambrian deposits, researchers have found evidence consistent with significantly shorter days hundreds of millions of years ago, and even shorter still in far deeper time. The exact numbers vary by dataset and interpretation, but the overall pattern is robust. The past held more sunrises per year than the present does. The rocks are not the only witnesses. Fossils can record this history as well. Certain organisms grew in ways that preserved daily and seasonal rhythms in their hard parts. Corals are among the most famous examples. Some ancient corals laid down fine growth bands that can be studied much like tree rings, though the comparison is not exact. If those bands include daily increments and broad annual markers, then the number of daily layers within one annual cycle can be counted. Once again, if a fossil year contains more daily increments than a modern year, it suggests that Earth rotated faster at the time the organism was alive. Shell growth patterns in other marine organisms can offer similar clues. So can stromatolites, layered structures built by microbial communities, though the interpretation there can be more complicated depending on preservation and context. The point is not that every fossil becomes a neat calendar. The point is that multiple kinds of natural archives, created by very different processes, can preserve information about repeating environmental cycles, and when those records are studied through paleontology, sedimentology, and paleoenvironmental reconstruction, they converge on the same broad conclusion. Earth's day used to be shorter. That is an astonishing sentence when allowed to sit quietly for a moment. It means the ordinary daily cycle, which feels so fundamental that it almost seems beyond history, is in fact historical. Noon itself has a past. Morning once returned more quickly. Night fell sooner. Earth spun faster beneath the moon, and the moon, through tidal friction, has been gradually slowing that spin for immense spans of time. Researchers who work on Precambrian geology and ancient environmental records are, in a sense, historians of motion. They do not only study rocks as objects, they study rocks as archives of process. Layer by layer, band by band, they reconstruct worlds that no human ever saw. Their evidence comes from mud, mineral grains, chemical signatures, fossil growth, and the patient mathematics of repeating patterns. It is a slow science in every sense, but it has the advantage of dealing directly with the planet's own memory, and that memory is surprisingly consistent. Modern lunar laser ranging shows that the moon is still moving outward today. Tidal theory explains why that recession and Earth's slowing rotation must be linked. Ancient sedimentary and fossil records show that Earth once rotated faster. Different methods, different timescales, and different branches of science all point toward the same long unfolding story. That kind of agreement is hard to dismiss. It is one of the clearest signs that this is not a clever speculation, but a real chapter in planetary history. There is also something wonderfully intimate about it. Discussions of orbital evolution can feel remote, as though they belong only to astronomers staring at diagrams of distant systems. But the length of a day is not remote. It shapes sleep, activity, temperature cycles, biology, and the very structure of ordinary experience. To say that the moon has helped determine how long a day feels on Earth is to bring the story back to human scale. The moon is not only changing abstract mechanics in the sky, it has helped shape the rhythm by which life on Earth unfolds. Of course, the change is so slow that no individual life notices it directly. No one wakes up and thinks the day feels longer because the moon has stolen another little fragment of rotational speed. Human beings are too brief for that. But geology is not brief, fossils are not brief, sediments are not brief. They carry the long view, and the long view shows that the moon has been quietly editing the pace of Earth's turning for billions of years. The effect is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There are no great visible gears in the heavens, no audible slowing of the planet, no official announcement from the sky that the day has gained another tiny fraction. The process is almost offensively calm. Tides move, friction acts, angular momentum shifts and the world turns a little more slowly than it once did. But the result, accumulated across deep time, is profound. The present length of a day is therefore not just a feature of Earth. It is an outcome of Earth's relationship with the Moon. The rocks say so. Fossils say so. Modern measurements say so. What feels fixed has been changing all along, and one of the main reasons is that the Moon has been patiently pulling on the planet for longer than any coastline, forest, animal, or civilization has existed. The sea rises and falls where people can see it. The deeper record lies in stone, where Earth has written the same truth more slowly. The Moon does not only shape the movement of the sea and the length of the day, it also helps steady the way Earth sits in space. That may sound like an oddly delicate task for something so large and ancient, but the stability of a planet's tilt is one of the quiet foundations of its climate. Earth does not spin with its axis standing straight up relative to its orbit around the Sun. Instead, it is tilted. That tilt, known in astronomy as axial tilt or obliquity, is the reason the seasons exist. One half of the planet leans a little more toward the Sun for part of the year and receives more direct sunlight, while the other half leans away and receives less. Then the situation reverses. Without tilt, there would be no familiar cycle of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. In the form, Earth now experiences them. So Earth's tilt matters enormously. It influences how sunlight is distributed across the globe, how strong seasonal contrasts become, and how climate patterns develop over time. A world with no tilt would be a very different place. A world with a much larger tilt would also be a very different place, with more extreme seasonal swings. A world whose tilt wandered unpredictably over immense spans of time could be stranger still. And this is where the Moon enters the story. Earth's axis is not fixed in space like a nail driven into wood. It moves slowly. The motion is called precession. The easiest way to picture it is to think of a spinning top. A top that is spinning well does not usually point in exactly one direction forever. Its axis slowly traces out a gentle circle or wobble. Earth does something similar. Its axis slowly shifts direction over long periods, tracing a broad circular motion in space. This precession does not mean the planet is tipping over wildly. It means the direction its axis points changes gradually through time. That wobble happens because Earth is not a perfect sphere. It has a slight equatorial bulge caused by rotation, and the gravitational pull of the Sun and Moon on that bulge creates torques that influence the axis. The Moon is especially important here because it exerts a strong stabilizing effect on how that axial motion behaves over long timescales. It helps set the pace and character of Earth's precession in a way that reduces the chance of larger, more chaotic swings in tilt. The key point is not that the Moon freezes Earth in one perfect posture. It does not. Earth's tilt does vary slightly over time, and those variations are part of the long natural rhythms of the climate system. But the presence of a large moon helps keep those changes within a more limited range than might otherwise be the case. The moon acts as a kind of gravitational moderator, not a complete controller, and certainly not a magical shield, but a stabilizing influence that makes Earth's axial behavior less erratic than it might have been. Without a large moon, Earth would still exist. It would still orbit the Sun. It would still have weather, oceans, rocks, clouds, and a long geological story. That is important to say clearly because this subject is sometimes exaggerated into the claim that Earth would be hopelessly unrecognizable or impossible without the moon. The science is more careful than that. The better claim is that Earth's long-term climatic stability may have been less steady without such a large lunar companion. The moon did not make Earth possible in every sense, but it may have helped make Earth more stable in one very consequential respect. The reason this matters is that axial tilt is deeply connected to climate. If Earth's obliquity were to swing much more dramatically over millions of years, the distribution of sunlight across latitudes would also swing more dramatically. Polar regions could receive much stronger seasonal sunlight in some eras and much less in others. Tropical and temperate patterns could shift in intensity. Ice, heat, rainfall, and circulation would all respond. Life can survive an enormous range of conditions, of course, but a more chaotically varying tilt could make the background climate story of the planet less predictable and less steady over deep time. One of the important modern researchers associated with this broader subject is Jacques Lascar, whose work in celestial mechanics and long-term orbital stability helped illuminate how planetary rotations and orbits can evolve over immense spans of time. Studies in this field have shown that planets are not always as dynamically calm as they may appear from a human perspective. Over millions of years, gravitational interactions can produce subtle but significant changes. Earth's large moon appears to help reduce the severity of such variation in tilt by influencing the precession of Earth's axis. Mars provides a useful contrast. Mars does not have a large stabilizing moon. Its two tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos, are far too small to play the kind of role the moon plays for Earth. As a result, Mars is thought to experience much larger variations in its axial tilt over long timescales. That does not mean Mars is in constant chaos every afternoon, but over geological history its tilt has been capable of wandering through a much broader range. That has major consequences for where ice is stable, how sunlight is distributed, and how climate changes over time. Earth, by contrast, appears more restrained. There is something deeply strange in that comparison. A familiar object in our night sky, something that can look almost ornamental above a quiet garden or a sleeping town, may have helped keep the whole planet from lurching through more dramatic long-term shifts in posture. The seasons themselves are not caused by the moon, of course. They're caused by Earth's tilt relative to its orbit around the Sun. But the moon helps steady that tilted arrangement over immense stretches of time. It does not write the seasons, but it may help keep the page from shaking too much. This moves the moon's influence into a much broader category than tides or even day length. Tides affect coasts. The slowing of Earth's spin affects the length of the day. But axial stability reaches into the overall environmental framework under which climates and ecosystems unfold. It belongs to the architecture of the planet rather than to one moving part. A more stable tilt does not guarantee a gentle world, and Earth's climate history has certainly included extremes, ice ages, warming periods, upheavals, and extinctions. Still, stability and obliquity means one major part of the system has remained more bounded than it might have been. That is no small thing. It also helps explain why the moon feels more and more like a true planetary partner the deeper this story goes. At first it seemed to govern only the sea. Then it entered the story of Earth's spin and the length of a day. Now it appears in the orientation of the planet itself, quietly, influencing the long-term steadiness of the conditions under which climate operates. The moon is no longer just shaping repeating events, it is helping shape the background stability of the world, and that may be one of its most important roles of all, not because it made Earth perfect, which it did not, and not because it single-handedly directed the history of life, which would be too strong a claim, but because it seems to have contributed to a kind of long patience in the system. A steadier tilt means a steadier framework for seasons over deep time. A steadier framework means fewer wild departures in one of the basic controls on climate. The moon, in other words, may have helped Earth remain more climatically composed than it otherwise would have been. For something that often looks like a silent witness, it has been remarkably involved. A more stable tilt does not just affect astronomy textbooks, it affects the lived character of a planet. Once Earth's axial tilt enters the climate story, the moon's influence begins to reach into something even broader than tides or day length. It enters the background conditions under which oceans circulate, weather patterns repeat, habitats persist, and life adapts. Not by controlling every detail, and certainly not by acting alone, but by helping keep one important part of the system from wandering too wildly over very long spans of time. The difference between ordinary seasons and deep time climate shifts is important here. Seasons are the familiar yearly result of Earth's tilt as it travels around the Sun. They are part of the normal annual rhythm of the planet. Summer follows spring, winter follows autumn, and the basic pattern repeats. That cycle feels stable because, on the timescale of a human life, it mostly is. But planetary climate also changes over much longer periods, and those changes can be influenced by slow variations in Earth's orbit and rotation. The moon matters not because it creates winter or summer, but because it helps keep the underlying tilt of the planet from drifting into much larger and more chaotic variations over millions of years. If that tilt were changing far more dramatically, the meaning of a season could shift with it. A modest seasonal contrast is one thing. A planet whose tilt swings through much broader angles over geological time is another. In such a world, the long-term distribution of sunlight across latitudes could change much more severely. Polar regions might at times receive much more intense summer sunlight than they do now. Tropical and temperate zones might experience very different patterns of heat and cold across deep time. The familiar stability of Earth's seasonal framework would be less reliable. This is where the work of Milutin Milankovitch becomes especially useful. Milankovitch studied how long-term variations in Earth's orbit and axial behavior influence climate over immense timescales. These slow astronomical patterns, now called Milankovitch cycles, include changes in Earth's orbital shape, the orientation of its axis, and the tilt itself. Together they alter how sunlight is distributed across the planet over tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. These cycles are strongly linked to major climate patterns, including the pacing of ice ages. The important thing is that Milankovitch cycles are not random chaos. They are structured long-term variations in the geometry of Earth's movement through space. Earth's climate has always responded to this slow astronomical rhythm. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Rainfall patterns shift. Ocean circulation changes. Habitats expand or contract. The moon is not the sole master of any of this, but it contributes to the stability of one crucial ingredient in the system by helping keep Earth's tilt within a narrower long-term range than it might otherwise occupy. That is a subtle role, but a profound one. Climate does not depend on a single factor. It depends on the atmosphere, oceans, continents, volcanic activity, greenhouse gases, orbital geometry, solar input, ice cover, and biological feedbacks, among many other things. The moon is not sitting above Earth pulling weather fronts around like strings on a map. It is not the hidden manager of every storm, current, or drought. But by helping stabilize Earth's axial tilt, it influences the long-term framework in which those other systems operate. A stable, seasonal framework matters for oceans. Surface heating and cooling patterns help drive circulation, stratification, and the exchange of heat between latitudes. If the tilt were varying far more dramatically over geological time, the broad climatic structure influencing ocean behavior could vary more dramatically as well. That would affect marine ecosystems, nutrient transport, and the long continuity of environmental conditions in which life evolves. Oceans are patient, but they are not indifferent to planetary geometry. It matters for weather patterns too. Atmospheric circulation depends on the way solar energy is distributed across the globe. The contrast between equator and poles helps drive winds, pressure systems, and storm tracks. A world with much greater swings in tilt would likely see stronger long-term rearrangements in those patterns. Not just colder or warmer years in the usual sense, but deep background changes in how the planet organises heat. Weather is the daily expression of climate, and climate is partly shaped by the posture of the planet itself. It matters for habitats as well. Stable long-term seasonality can help preserve recurring environmental zones across millions of years, even while those zones shift and change in detail. Forests, grasslands, reefs, polar environments, and coastal systems all depend on the rhythms of temperature, light, rainfall, and circulation. Evolution does not require perfect calm, and in truth, life often thrives amid change. But there is a difference between productive variability and extreme long-term instability in one of the fundamental controls on climate. A more bounded tilt likely helped keep Earth's environmental story more coherent than it might otherwise have been. That coherence matters for evolutionary continuity. Species adapt to change, migrate, diversify, and sometimes vanish. But when one of the planet's most basic astronomical settings remains comparatively stable, the long unfolding of ecosystems has a steadier background against which to proceed. The Moon did not write the history of life, but it may have helped keep part of the stage from tilting too wildly beneath it. That is not a small contribution. There is also something quietly humbling in the scale of it. The same Moon that lights shorelines and pulls on tides has likely helped preserve a certain climatic restraint in the Earth system. It is not glamorous work. It does not produce a visible spectacle each night. No one looks up at the Moon and immediately thinks about bounded obliquity ranges or the long-term moderation of seasonal extremes. But those hidden influences may be among the most important ones. This is where the Moon's role becomes less about direct visible action and more about environmental context. It has already shown itself capable of moving water, flexing rock, slowing Earth's spin, and receding outward as part of a long gravitational exchange. Now it appears as a contributor to planetary steadiness. Not the sole controller of climate, not the author of every cycle, but a real participant in the architecture of long-term stability. And stability has its own quiet value. It rarely announces itself. It is easier to notice catastrophe than the absence of catastrophe. Easier to admire spectacle than moderation. But for a planet that hosts oceans, weather, coastlines, ecosystems, and evolving life, steadiness in one of the great astronomical controls is no trivial gift. The Moon's pull has done more than lift the sea. It has helped keep Earth's long climatic rhythms within a range that made the world more consistent than it might otherwise have been. For something so often treated as a silent ornament, that is an astonishing level of involvement. Long before forests, shells, fish, or even the first true cells in the form now recognised from later Earth history, there were coastlines. Or at least there were places where water met land, where liquids spread and withdrew, where minerals were soaked, dried, dissolved, and left behind again. The young Earth was not a calm blue world waiting politely for life to begin. It was restless, chemically active, and physically rough. Oceans, volcanic landscapes, an atmosphere unlike the present one, and a planet still cooling from its violent beginnings all combined to create a setting very different from the familiar modern Earth. And within that unsettled world, the Moon may already have been shaping some of the most interesting environments of all. This is where the story moves from climate and planetary stability into something even more delicate. Not the origin of life itself as a solved event, because it is nothing of the sort, but the question of whether the Moon may have helped create or sustain physical settings in which important prebiotic chemistry became more likely. That is a more careful claim, and a more scientifically honest one. The Moon did not create life by itself. No serious version of the science says that it did. But by shaping tides, coastlines, and repeated cycles of flooding and exposure, it may have influenced some of the places where chemistry had opportunities to become more complex. The idea begins with shallow coastal environments. Tidal flats, temporary pools, lagoon edges, and wet-dry margins are not just scenic pieces of geography. Chemically, they can be unusually interesting places. When water repeatedly advances and retreats, it does more than move sediment around. It changes concentration, it alters salinity, it exposes dissolved substances to drying, heating, mineral surfaces, and renewed wetting. Molecules that might remain thinly dispersed in a deep ocean can become concentrated in shallower environments. Materials can be carried in, left behind, mixed, and cycled through changing conditions over and over again. That is scientifically important, because one of the major challenges in origin of life research is understanding how relatively simple chemical ingredients could have formed more complex structures under early Earth conditions. It is one thing to produce basic organic molecules. It is another to concentrate them, link them into larger assemblies, and keep them in environments where those assemblies are not immediately destroyed or diluted. Wet-dry cycling is one of the reasons certain shoreline settings attract scientific interest. When a pool partly dries, the substances within it become more concentrated. When it floods again, they are redistributed. Repetition can matter. Chemistry is often less about a single dramatic event and more about the consequences of being given the right conditions again and again. Tidal environments provide exactly that kind of repetition. A strong tidal system can produce cyclical wetting and drying, fluctuating salt levels, variable temperatures in shallow waters, and regular contact with mineral-rich sediments. None of that guarantees life. It does not even guarantee the precise chemical pathways that matter most. But it does create a physically dynamic setting that many researchers consider worth serious attention. This is where caution is necessary, because origin of life science is full of possibilities, models, and competing environments. Some hypotheses focus on deep-sea hydrothermal vents. Others emphasize volcanic pools, geothermal fields, mineral surfaces, ice environments, or combinations of multiple settings. The early Earth likely offered many chemically active environments, and it is entirely possible that no single location type explains everything. The shoreline model is therefore not a final answer. It is one plausible class of setting among several scientifically discussed options. That distinction matters. The goal here is not to smuggle speculation into the story disguised as certainty. Even so, tidal worlds remain compelling. One reason is concentration. In a vast ocean, even useful molecules can be too diluted to interact efficiently. In shallow coastal pools or periodically evaporating margins, concentration becomes easier. Another reason is mineral contact. Clays and other mineral surfaces can provide places where molecules gather, align, or react in ways that differ from free-floating chemistry in open water. A third reason is repeated cycling itself. Many chemical systems benefit from alternation rather than steady conditions. Wet, then dry. Dilute, then concentrated. Cool, then warm. Saltier, then fresher. Stable environments are valuable for many later forms of life, but unstable repeated environments may be surprisingly useful for the chemistry that comes before life. Researchers connected with prebiotic chemistry in early Earth studies, including work associated with Jack Szostak and other origin of life laboratories, have explored how simple building blocks might assemble into more complex molecules or primitive protocell-like structures under plausible early Earth conditions. Some of this work has highlighted the importance of environmental cycling, especially when it comes to concentration, membrane formation, and the assembly of informational or catalytic molecules. Again, That does not prove that life began on a tidal flat under moonlit skies, while the universe watched approvingly. Reality is rarely so narratively tidy, but it does support the broader idea that cyclic nearshore environments deserve real scientific attention. There is also a deeper historical possibility here. Early in Earth's history, the moon was closer than it is now. Because tidal force becomes much stronger at smaller distances, ancient tides may have been more powerful than modern ones. That does not mean the entire planet was permanently drowning in absurd walls of water, but it does suggest that tidal influence on shallow margins could have been especially strong under some early Earth conditions. If so, the moon may have helped produce energetic coastal landscapes where repeated chemical cycling was even more pronounced than it is now. That possibility is intriguing because it links the moon's gravitational role to a very old biological threshold, one that predates animals, plants, and perhaps even the first stable cells. It suggests that lunar influence may have mattered not only to later ecosystems and climates, but to the physical environments in which prebiotic chemistry was happening long before life had anything like a face, a skeleton, or a leaf. Of course, none of this means the moon should be credited as the inventor of biology. That would be nonsense, and quite unfair to chemistry. Life emerged from a network of processes involving water, energy sources, carbon chemistry, planetary conditions, and enormous spans of time. The moon may have contributed by shaping some of the environments where those processes unfolded, but it was not a lone author. At most, it may have helped arrange part of the stage, and yet that is still remarkable. The same gravitational relationship that later shaped tides, coastlines, day length, and climate stability may have mattered in some form even earlier, at the threshold where chemistry was trying, repeatedly and imperfectly, to become something more organized. The moon's role, if real in this context, was not to inject life into Earth like some celestial spark. It was to help sustain dynamic settings in which molecules had repeated opportunities to concentrate, interact, assemble, fall apart, and try again. That kind of patient repetition appears throughout the moon's story. It slows Earth by patience. It moves the sea by patience. It may even have aided prebiotic chemistry by patience. There is something fitting in that. The moon never seems to rush anything. It does not solve problems in one theatrical moment. It works through cycles, through repetition, through the power of conditions held and repeated over unimaginable spans of time. If early shorelines mattered to the chemistry that preceded life, then the moon may have been involved not as a miracle worker, but as an environmental disciplinarian, keeping the rhythms going, drawing waters in and out, exposing and flooding, concentrating and relaxing again and again. And that moves its influence into an even deeper layer of Earth's story, not merely into the history of oceans or climate, but into the possibility that some of the first chemically promising environments on this planet were shaped in part by a nearby moon pulling on a young world long before any eye existed to look back at it. If early tides may have helped shape chemically interesting shorelines before life fully emerged, later tides certainly helped shape places where life could flourish once it did. The same repeated movement of water that may once have concentrated simple molecules now does something equally important for living systems. It builds and maintains habitats, it sorts sediments, carries nutrients, flushes estuaries, oxygenates shallow waters, and creates one of the most dynamic boundaries on Earth, the place where land and sea keep trading custody of the same patch of ground. A shoreline may look still in a photograph, but in reality it is an argument between water, gravity, sediment, and time. The moon is part of that argument every day. As tides rise and fall, they do more than change where the waterline sits. They move mud, sand, shell fragments, dissolve nutrients, larvae, detritus, and oxygen-rich water through coastal systems over and over again. This turns the tide into an ecological architect. It does not merely visit a habitat. It helps make the habitat what it is. Mudflats are a good place to begin. At low tide they can appear stark and almost empty, broad exposed plains of wet sediment reflecting the sky. But they are often among the most biologically active places along a coast. Fine sediments settle there because the water is slow enough in certain conditions to let particles drop out. Organic material accumulates. Worms, mollusks, crustaceans, and microorganisms work through the mud. Birds arrive to feed. Then the tide returns, covering the flat again, bringing fresh water movement, redistributing materials, and beginning the cycle once more. The habitat exists because the water does not stay in one state. It alternates. Salt marshes depend on that alternation too. These are not simply patches of coastal grass that happen to get wet now and then. They are environments defined by regular tidal flooding, by salty or brackish water, by muddy sediments, and by plants adapted to life at the edge of sea and land. The tide brings in suspended sediments and dissolved nutrients. It shapes drainage channels. It controls how often the marsh is submerged and for how long. A salt marsh is, in effect, a landscape patterned by lunar rhythm. Without repeated tides, it would not function as the same kind of place at all. Estuaries make the story even richer. An estuary is where river water meets the sea, and that meeting is never simple. Fresh water moves outward. Salt water pushes inward with the tide. Sediments settle, resuspend, and travel. Nutrients from land mix with marine inputs. Oxygen levels, salinity, turbidity, and currents all shift with time and place. Estuaries are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth, in part because they are constantly being reworked by this tidal exchange. The Moon, by driving much of that exchange, helps regulate the movement of life-supporting materials through the system. Tidal flushing is one of the key ideas here. As water moves in and out of estuaries, marshes, creeks, and shallow embayments, it transports nutrients, oxygen, larvae, sediments, and organic matter. This is not just scenic motion, it is delivery, removal, mixing, and renewal. Nutrients can be brought into coastal systems and redistributed through them. Oxygenated water can refresh shallow habitats. Larvae released by marine organisms can be carried into nurseries or out toward new environments. Organic material can be transported from marsh to channel, from channel to bay, and from bay to sea. The tide is therefore part conveyor belt, part ventilation system, and part habitat engineer. Mangroves offer another remarkable example, especially in tropical and subtropical coasts. These tangled coastal forests live in intertidal zones where roots are regularly flooded and exposed. The tidal rhythm shapes sediment deposition around their roots, moves nutrients through the system, and helps connect mangrove habitats with adjacent mudflats, seagrass beds, and coral reefs. Juvenile fish, crustaceans, and many other organisms use these areas as shelter and nursery grounds. Again, the Moon's influence is not just moving water back and forth for the sake of it. It is helping maintain one of the structural foundations of coastal life. All of this becomes especially vivid in the intertidal zone, the strip of coast that lies between high tide and low tide. This is one of the most variable environments on the planet. An organism living there may be submerged in seawater for part of the day and exposed to open air for another part. It may face drying, heating, cooling, wave stress, changing salinity, reduced oxygen in isolated pools, and sudden immersion once more. The Moon, through the tides, creates this alternating world. Life in the intertidal zone is therefore shaped not by one steady set of conditions, but by repeated extremes. That is why intertidal organisms are often so specialized. Barnacles cement themselves to rock, mussels cling by strong threads, Crabs retreat into burrows or crevices. Seaweeds tolerate repeated exposure and rehydration. Snails seal themselves against drying. The intertidal zone does not reward laziness. It is a place of endurance, timing, and adaptation, built around the certainty that the sea will leave and return. The moon is not simply nearby while this happens. It is part of the reason this environment exists in the first place. Marine ecology and coastal geomorphology both help explain these systems. Marine ecology studies how organisms interact with one another and with their environments in the sea. Coastal geomorphology studies how coastlines are shaped by physical forces such as waves, tides, sediments, and sea level. Together they show that coastal habitats are neither purely biological nor purely geological. They are mixed products of living systems and physical process. Tides sit right at the centre of that meeting point. This is one reason institutions such as marine laboratories, coastal observatories, and places like the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution matter so much. They help scientists track the movement of water, sediment, nutrients, and organisms through complex coastal systems. What looks like a simple marsh edge or shallow inlet often turns out to be a deeply connected network in which tidal timing influences feeding, breeding, oxygen exchange, erosion, deposition, and habitat structure all at once. The moon's role can therefore be traced not only in the height of the water, but in the functioning of the ecosystem. There is also a lovely continuity here with the older question of early Earth. The tidal environments that may once have offered chemically dynamic settings before life fully emerged are now among the places where life most vividly expresses the power of repeated flooding and exposure. Ancient tides may have helped shape prebiotic worlds. Modern tides shape living coastlines. The same physical rhythm carries across an immense biological divide. That continuity makes the moon feel even more deeply woven into the story of Earth. Its pull may have mattered in the chemistry before life, and it certainly matters in the ecology after life. It helps create places where nutrients circulate, sediments settle, oxygen arrives, and habitats persist. The tide is not just a movement, it is an organizer. So when the sea withdraws from a mudflat, when salt marsh channels fill, when mangrove roots are submerged, when estuarine water turns and mixes, or when a rocky shore is alternately exposed and covered, the moon is doing more than demonstrating gravity. It is helping structure a living edge of the planet. Coastal life is shaped not just by sunlight, salt, and water, but by the repeated timing of the tide itself. The shoreline is not merely where the land ends. In many places it is where lunar rhythm becomes habitat. Once the moon has shaped a habitat, life often begins to shape itself around the moon in return. That is one of the most fascinating turns in the whole story. Tides build mudflats, marshes, estuaries, and intertidal zones. They flood and expose, transport and mix, connect and separate. But many organisms do not merely endure those rhythms, they use them. Over evolutionary time, some species have become so closely tied to lunar cycles that parts of their lives now run on a schedule written partly by the moon. Feeding, reproduction, migration, emergence, and mass spawning can all be timed to patterns linked to lunar phase, moonlight, tidal range, or some combination of the three. This means the moon's influence is no longer only physical, it becomes biological. It enters the timing systems of living things. Most people are familiar with the idea of a daily biological rhythm, the cycle of waking and sleeping tied to the day-night pattern. That is called a circadian rhythm. But life is capable of using longer clocks as well. Some organisms show circalunar rhythms, meaning biological cycles that track the lunar month. Others show semilunar rhythms, linked to roughly half that period, often corresponding to the repeating pattern of stronger and weaker tides. These are not just poetic associations, they are real timing systems that help organisms anticipate recurring environmental change. This is where chronobiology becomes relevant. Chronobiology is the study of biological timing, of the internal clocks that help organisms organize their lives in relation to regular cycles in the environment. Light, temperature, food availability, tides, and seasonal change can all help set these clocks. Researchers who study biological rhythms have shown that many organisms are not simply reacting moment by moment to whatever the world happens to do. They are often anticipating change through internal timing mechanisms shaped by evolution. The moon provides several kinds of signals that living systems can use. Moonlight changes across the lunar month. Tidal range changes as the moon and sun align differently. Currents and water depth shift with the tides. Exposure and immersion follow predictable patterns. So when an organism appears to be responding to the moon, it may actually be responding to multiple linked cues at once. That is important to say clearly. Life is not always reading the moon directly like a glowing calendar in the sky. Sometimes it is reading tides, current strength, flooding frequency, darkness level, or ecological opportunities that happen to follow lunar timing. Coral spawning is one of the most famous and striking examples. In some reef systems, many corals release eggs and sperm into the water in a tightly coordinated event linked to particular times in the lunar cycle, often after a full moon. The effect can be astonishing, with entire stretches of reef seeming to spawn almost in unison. Timing matters enormously here. Releasing reproductive material together increases the chances of successful fertilization, and can also overwhelm predators that might otherwise consume much of it. The synchronization is not thought to depend on moonlight alone. Water temperature, seasonal cues, and internal biological timing all play roles. But lunar phase is one of the critical signals in the system. The moon, in this sense, helps schedule reproduction on a reef. Marine worms provide another remarkable case. Some species time reproductive emergence or swarming behavior to specific phases of the moon. In certain polychaete worms, this can involve mature individuals leaving burrows or appearing in the water column at highly predictable points in the lunar cycle. The timing improves the chance of meeting others of the same species and releasing gametes under conditions that suit dispersal and survival. It is difficult not to admire the level of coordination involved. For creatures without meetings, calendars, or group chats, the moon serves surprisingly well. Fish can also live by lunar timing. Grunion, the small fish famous for their beach spawning, runs along parts of the California coast, are a particularly vivid example. These fish come ashore on sandy beaches to lay eggs during specific high tides associated with lunar cycles. The eggs remain buried in the sand above the normal waterline until later tides help trigger hatching. This behavior depends on exquisitely timed interaction between reproduction, tidal height, and the returning sea. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that the moon can help shape not only where organisms live, but when key moments in their life cycle occur. Crabs, too, often show lunar-linked patterns. Some species synchronize larval release with particular tidal conditions, increasing the chance that offspring are carried into suitable waters rather than stranded in risky shallow zones. Others time reproductive or migratory behavior to semi-lunar patterns, effectively using the rhythm of stronger and weaker tides as part of their schedule. In such cases, the moon is not merely acting on the water around the animal. It is influencing the timing of biological events inside a living system. What is so striking about all this is that the moon becomes part of a species' strategy. Timing is not a decorative detail in biology. It can determine survival, reproductive success, predator avoidance, and dispersal. Releasing eggs at the wrong tide, emerging at the wrong phase, or spawning when currents are unfavourable can be costly. Over long evolutionary timescales, organisms that align their behavior with reliable recurring patterns often do better than those that do not. The Moon offers one of the most dependable recurring patterns available in many coastal and marine settings. This is especially true where tides dominate the shape of the habitat. In intertidal and shallow coastal systems, lunar timing is not an optional extra. It is woven into the environment itself. Water depth changes, feeding opportunities appear and vanish, predators arrive or retreat, currents strengthen or weaken. The Moon helps create the schedule of the habitat, and life evolves to follow that schedule. There's also something quietly beautiful in the fact that these rhythms go beyond the simple, daily alternation of light and dark. Life is not only listening to the sun. In some environments it is listening to a slower clock as well. Not all species do this, of course. Many organisms are not tightly tied to lunar cycles. But where those cycles matter, they matter deeply. The timing of reproduction or emergence can become as essential as anatomy. Researchers in chronobiology and marine ecology continue to study how these clocks work, including the molecular and sensory mechanisms that allow organisms to track lunar or tidal patterns. In some cases, it appears that internal biological oscillators may run on monthly or half-monthly schedules. In others, external cues repeatedly reset or reinforce the timing. The full details are still being worked out in many species, which is often the case when biology is at its most interesting. Nature is generous with examples and stingy with complete explanations. Still, the overall pattern is unmistakable. The Moon helps govern more than the movement of shorelines. It influences the timing of living systems. It helps set the schedules by which eggs are released, larvae are carried, worms emerge, corals spawn, and fish rush onto beaches with astonishing precision and a questionable sense of personal safety. The Moon is therefore part of biology as well as physics. It shapes not only places but timings. That deepens the story in an important way. Earlier, the Moon was shaping coastlines and habitats from the outside through water movement and physical force. Now it appears inside the behavior of organisms themselves as part of the clockwork of life. The habitat and the animal become linked by the same repeating lunar pattern. The tide rises, the reef responds, the fish arrive, the worms emerge, the corals spawn. Over and over again, the living world answers a rhythm that began in gravity. The Moon, it turns out, does not just move the sea. In some corners of Earth, it helps tell life when to begin. Not every lunar influence arrives through the movement of water. Some of it arrives through light. That is a quieter kind of control, and in some ways a more delicate one. Tides are large physical events. They flood estuaries, expose mudflats, and reshape what animals can do from 1 hour to the next. Moonlight is subtler. A full moon does not suddenly turn night into day. In physical terms, moonlight is extremely dim compared with sunlight, so faint that the comparison is almost unfair. Daylight overwhelms it completely, and yet for animals adapted to darkness, that faint light can still matter enormously. A brighter night is not the same as a dark one. To a creature whose world is tuned to very low light, the Moon can change the meaning of the night itself. This is where sensory ecology becomes useful. Sensory ecology looks at how organisms gather information from the world and how environmental signals shape behavior. Light is one of the most important of those signals. Not only strong light, like sunlight at noon, but also weak light at dusk, starlight, or moonlight. Many animals do not need much illumination at all to detect changes in risk, opportunity, direction, or timing. What seems dim to a human glancing out of a bedroom window can be biologically significant to eyes, nervous systems, and habits built by evolution for a darker world. Moonlight can affect predators and prey in opposite ways at the same time. A brighter night may help a predator see more clearly. It may also make the predator more visible. For prey animals, that same brighter night can mean greater danger if concealment depends on darkness. As a result, behavior often shifts with lunar phase. In some nocturnal rodents, activity declines during bright moonlit nights. That pattern has been observed in multiple environments, especially in open habitats, where the risk of being seen by owls, foxes, or other predators rises when the ground is more brightly lit. A full moon does not issue instructions, but it changes the information available to both hunter and hunted. There is something almost elegant about that. The moon does not need to move an animal physically in order to influence it. It only needs to change the conditions under which choices are made. More light can mean more food for one species and more danger for another. In that sense, lunar control through illumination is a matter of information as much as force. Seabirds provide another example. Some species appear to use lunar cues in navigation, foraging, or the timing of movement, especially in environments where light levels over the ocean matter. For a bird travelling over dark water, even small changes in illumination can alter visibility, orientation, and feeding conditions. This does not mean every seabird is secretly consulting the moon like a careful navigator with a silver clock in the sky. It means that lunar light can become one of several recurring signals built into the ecology of the night. Reef organisms also respond to illumination cycles. In coral reef systems, the timing of activity can depend not only on tides and currents, but on the changing brightness of the night across the lunar month. Some organisms feed, hide, emerge, or reproduce under specific lunar lighting conditions. Coral spawning, already tied in many cases to lunar phase, may involve light as one cue among several. Reef animals that avoid predators under brighter nights may shift their behavior differently from species that use the added light to forage. A moonlit reef is not merely a dimmer version of daytime, it is its own ecological setting, with altered visibility and altered decisions. This needs to be handled carefully, because lunar light does not have the same universal force as tides. Tides are direct physical consequences of gravity, and their presence is obvious wherever large bodies of water respond. Moonlight is different. Its effects are more species-dependent, more context-dependent, and often more subtle. Some animals are strongly affected, others seem hardly affected at all. Habitat matters. Cloud cover matters, predation risk matters, eye structure matters. Artificial lighting now matters too, especially in human-altered environments where electric light can wash out natural lunar cycles almost completely. That difference in scale is important. The moon's influence through light is real, but it is not as uniform as its influence through gravity. It works through perception, and perception is never as simple as force. One species may reduce activity on bright nights, another may increase it, and a third may respond only in certain seasons or habitats. This does not weaken the point, it refines it. Lunar light is not a single command delivered to nature. It is a recurring signal interpreted differently by different living systems. That very subtlety is part of what makes it interesting. The moon is no longer acting like a distant engine moving water around the planet. It is acting like a source of environmental information. The phases of the moon alter nocturnal brightness in a repeating way, and some organisms have evolved to read that signal. A moonlit night can mean improved navigation, increased danger, better hunting, worse concealment, or the right timing for a specific reproductive event. The signal is faint, but reliable. There is also an important contrast between moonlight and complete darkness. Nights without much lunar illumination are not merely darker by a small amount. In ecological terms, they can become different kinds of nights, Certain prey species may forage more boldly. Certain predators may hunt less effectively if they rely on sight. Activity patterns can shift across the lunar months simply because the information content of the environment shifts. To a human indoors, this might sound almost trivial. To an animal living close to the threshold of visibility, it can shape survival. This broadens the moon's role once again. It has already shown itself as a force that moves water, flexes rock, slows Earth's spin, helps stabilize axial tilt, structures coastlines, and times reproduction in some species. Now it appears as a source of recurring nocturnal information. The moon's control can therefore work in two very different ways. It can act through force, as in tides, or it can act through signal, as in moonlight. One moves environments directly, the other changes how organisms interpret those environments. That is a remarkable range of influence for a single body in the sky, and it gives the night a slightly different character once this is understood. A bright moon is not just a beautiful scene or a helpful light for a late walk. In many ecosystems, it is a meaningful change in the operating conditions of the dark. Rodents hesitate, predators adjust, birds orient, reef organisms alter their timing. The moon does not need to say anything. Its light is enough. So the biological story widens from tides and spawning into something softer, but still significant. Not all lunar control is dramatic. Some of it works through brightness, visibility and timing. Some of it is written not in the movement of the sea, but in the decisions animals make when the world is only faintly lit. The moon, in those moments, is not pulling on bodies so much as whispering to senses. The moon can move oceans, slow the turning of Earth, shape coastlines, and influence living rhythms. But sometimes it does something far more theatrical. Sometimes it steps directly into the light. An eclipse is one of the clearest and most dramatic reminders that the moon does more than pull on the sea. It can alter what appears in the sky itself. It can interrupt sunlight, darken daytime, redden the moon, and make the geometry of the Earth-Moon-Sun system suddenly visible in a way that no diagram ever quite matches. For a few minutes, orbital mechanics stops being an abstract idea and becomes a spectacle. What makes eclipses so compelling is that they are not caused by some special new force. They are caused by alignment. The moon orbits Earth. Earth orbits the sun. Light travels in straight lines. When these motions line up in the right way, shadows fall and the sky reveals the structure of the system. There are two main kinds of eclipse. A solar eclipse happens when the moon passes between Earth and the sun, blocking some or all of the sun's light for observers along a narrow path on Earth's surface. A lunar eclipse happens when Earth passes between the sun and the moon, casting Earth's shadow across the lunar surface. In one case, the moon blocks sunlight from reaching Earth directly. In the other, Earth blocks sunlight from reaching the moon. The same three bodies are involved, but the arrangement is reversed. That much is simple enough. The more interesting question is why eclipses do not happen every month. After all, the moon goes around Earth roughly once a month, and there is a new moon and a full moon every month. If alignment is the key, then surely eclipses should be routine, but the moon's orbit is tilted. More precisely, the plane of the moon's orbit around Earth is inclined by about 5 degrees relative to the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. That may not sound like much, but in celestial geometry it is enough to matter. Most months, when the moon reaches new moon or full moon, it passes slightly above or slightly below the precise line needed for an eclipse. The alignment is close, but not close enough. So the sun, Earth, and moon usually miss perfect shadow making by a small but decisive margin. The two places where the moon's tilted orbit crosses the plane of Earth's orbit are called the nodes. If the moon is near one of these crossing points at the same time as a new moon or full moon, then an eclipse becomes possible. The line joining these crossing points is called the line of nodes. It sounds a little severe, but the concept is gentle enough. It simply marks where the tilted lunar path intersects the broader flat reference plane of Earth's journey around the Sun. Eclipses require timing plus geometry. The phase must be right, and the moon must also be near a node. That combination gives eclipses a kind of precision. They're not random interruptions. They're consequences of orbital architecture. A solar eclipse can happen only at new moon, when the moon is between Earth and the Sun. A lunar eclipse can happen only at full moon, when Earth is between the Sun and the moon, and even then the nodes must be involved, or the shadows miss. Solar eclipses are perhaps the most arresting because they transform daylight itself. When the alignment is exact enough, and the moon appears large enough in the sky to cover the Sun's bright disk completely, the result is a total solar eclipse. Day fades. The solar corona becomes visible, ghostly and delicate around the darkened Sun. Temperatures can drop slightly. Birds sometimes fall quiet. It is one of those rare moments when the sky seems to reveal not just beauty but structure. Lunar eclipses are quieter, though no less elegant. In a total lunar eclipse, the moon passes fully into Earth's shadow, but it usually does not disappear. Instead, it often turns deep red or coppery. This happens because Earth's atmosphere bends and filters sunlight into the shadow, allowing redder wavelengths to reach the moon more effectively than bluer ones. In a sense, every sunrise and sunset around Earth is helping paint the eclipsed moon. It is an unusually poetic result for atmospheric scattering. One of the strangest features of solar eclipses from Earth is that the moon and sun appear almost the same size in the sky. This is a coincidence of distance and scale. The sun is vastly larger than the moon, but it is also vastly farther away. By chance, the proportions work out in such a way that the moon can cover the sun's visible disk almost exactly. That coincidence is temporary on geological timescales, because the moon is slowly receding from Earth. Earlier, the moon would have appeared larger. Far in the future, it will appear smaller. The present era happens to be one in which total solar eclipses are possible in their current form. That makes Earth's sky rather special. Not every planet with a moon gets this kind of precise visual alignment. Here, the geometry happens to be dramatic enough to produce one of the most extraordinary natural sights available to human eyes. The moon is not only shaping oceans and timing rhythms, it is participating in a visual coincidence that turns orbital mechanics into wonder. Eclipses have also mattered scientifically. Observations during total solar eclipses have helped astronomers study the sun's corona, which is usually hidden by the brightness of the solar disk. The famous eclipse expeditions connected with tests of Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity used the apparent positions of stars near the eclipsed sun to test whether gravity bends light. In that sense, eclipses have served not only as spectacles, but as opportunities for measurement. Organisations such as NASA and bodies including the Royal Astronomical Society have long helped interpret, observe and communicate these events, placing them within the broader story of astronomy rather than leaving them as mere sky drama. And sky drama they certainly are, but they are disciplined drama, if that makes sense. The moon is not improvising. It is revealing through shadow and alignment how the system is arranged. An eclipse makes invisible geometry visible. It turns orbit into event. There is also a pleasing continuity with the previous story of moonlight. A chapter ago, the moon was influencing the night by degrees, subtly altering brightness and behaviour in creatures adapted to darkness. Here, it changes light in a far more dramatic way. Instead of whispering to senses through a brighter night sky, It rearranges the relationship between light and shadow on a planetary scale. The same object that softly changes nocturnal conditions can also, under the right geometry, block the sun itself. That range of influence is part of what makes the moon feel less and less like a passive companion and more like an active partner in Earth's experience of the sky. It does not only pull, time, and illuminate, it also aligns. It enters the line between Earth and Sun, or receives Earth's shadow across its face, making the architecture of the system briefly impossible to ignore. So an eclipse is more than a beautiful event. It is a moment when the moon's broader role becomes visible all at once. It reveals distance, timing, tilt, orbital planes, and the remarkable precision of a moving system that usually hides its own structure in plain sight. The moon, for a little while, does not merely control tides or guide living rhythms. It takes command of light and shadow, and the sky becomes geometry made visible. A good way to understand the moon's importance is to imagine its absence. Not because Earth without a moon would be impossible, lifeless by definition, or somehow not a proper planet. That would be too dramatic, and the science does not support it. Earth would still be a rocky world orbiting the sun. It would still have gravity, weather, oceans, an atmosphere, and a geological history. Day and night would still exist. Seasons would still exist if Earth remained tilted. Tides would not vanish entirely, because the sun also raises tides. Life in some form might still have emerged and persisted. So this is not a story about absolute dependence. It is a story about difference. Remove the moon, and the first obvious change would be the tides. Solar tides would remain, but they are weaker than lunar tides. Without the moon, the regular rise and fall of the sea would be much reduced in strength. Coastlines would still change with the water, but less dramatically. Mud flats, salt marshes, estuaries, tidal channels, and intertidal zones would likely be different in extent, timing, and ecological character. Some habitats would shrink, some would become less dynamic, some patterns of nutrient transport, sediment movement, and larval dispersal would change. The sea would still breathe, but more quietly. That consequence is strongly supported because it follows directly from gravitational physics. The moon is the main driver of Earth's tides. Take it away, and the main driver goes with it. The second major difference would concern Earth's rotation. Without a large moon raising strong tides, tidal friction would have been much weaker over geological time. Earth would therefore have lost rotational speed more slowly. The present length of the day might be quite different. The exact result would depend on the details of Earth's early history and internal dynamics, but the broad point is clear. A world without a large moon would not have experienced the same long tidal breaking that shaped the day length now taken for granted. Sunrise and sunset might still feel ordinary to any life adapted to them, but the deep history behind that daily cycle would be different. That too is strongly grounded in the physics already traced through the Earth-Moon system. No moon means much weaker lunar tides. Weaker tides mean less tidal friction. Less tidal friction means less efficient slowing of Earth's spin. Then there is axial stability, and here the story becomes even more interesting. Earth's tilt, or obliquity, helps determine the seasons by controlling how sunlight is distributed across the planet during the year. A large moon appears to help stabilize that tilt over long time scales by influencing the precession of Earth's axis. Without such a moon, Earth's tilt might have varied more strongly and less predictably over millions of years. That does not mean Earth would tumble chaotically every other Tuesday, or that the planet would become uninhabitable in some cinematic way. It means the long-term climatic background could have been less steady. This is where Mars becomes a useful comparison. Mars has only two tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos, and neither is remotely capable of doing what the moon does for Earth. Mars is thought to have experienced much larger variations in axial tilt over deep time. Those variations affect where sunlight falls, where ice is stable, and how climate shifts over geological history. Earth is not Mars, of course, and no comparison between planets is ever perfect. Still, Mars offers a plausible example of what a planet can look like when it lacks a large stabilizing moon. Researchers such as Jacques Lasker, working in celestial mechanics and orbital dynamics, have helped illuminate how these long-term rotational and orbital variations can behave. Here it is important to stay honest about scale. The idea that Earth's tilt would likely have been less stable without the Moon is well supported. The exact climatic consequences, however, involve more uncertainty. Climate depends on many things at once, including atmosphere, oceans, continents, greenhouse gases, volcanic history, and solar input. So it would be wrong to claim that without the Moon, Earth would necessarily have become wildly unrecognizable. The better statement is more restrained. A moonless Earth may well have had a less steady axial history, and that could have produced stronger long-term climatic swings. Even that more careful phrasing still matters a great deal. A less stable tilt would affect seasonal patterns across deep time. It would influence the distribution of sunlight between low and high latitudes. It could alter atmospheric circulation, ocean behavior, ice stability, and habitat continuity. The Moon would not be missing from some decorative corner of the story. It would be missing from part of the architecture of planetary steadiness itself. The coastline story would change as well in more speculative but still plausible ways. If strong tides played a role in the chemistry of early shallow environments, helping create repeated wet-dry cycles and concentration effects relevant to prebiotic chemistry, then a moonless Earth may have offered fewer or weaker versions of some of those settings. That does not mean life would not have emerged. Origin of life research is too uncertain for such dramatic declarations. Other environments, including hydrothermal systems and geothermal settings, might still have provided suitable pathways. But it does mean that one potentially useful class of early environment would have been altered. That belongs in the category of informed possibility rather than firm conclusion. The biological consequences later in Earth's history would also be significant. Many coastal habitats would still exist in some form, and many organisms would still follow daily and seasonal rhythms, but species whose behaviours are closely tied to strong tidal cycles, semi-lunar rhythms, or very specific lunar timing would either not exist in the same way or would have evolved different strategies. Coral spawning patterns, Grunion beach runs, intertidal feeding rhythms, larval release schedules, and countless subtler behaviours would all belong to a different ecological world. The Moon's absence would not erase biology. It would rewrite part of biology's schedule. The night sky itself would change in obvious ways too. There would be no familiar bright moon, no lunar phases, no moonlit landscapes, no total solar eclipses of the kind seen from Earth today, and no lunar eclipses. The sun would still rise and set, stars would still cross the night, but one of the sky's most dramatic features would be gone. The geometry that currently allows the Moon to cover the sun so precisely would not exist at all. Earth's sky would lose one of its great recurring spectacles. That part is straightforward. No moon means no eclipse partnership between Earth, Moon, and Sun. What this thought experiment really does is gather the earlier strands into one place. Weaker tides, different coastlines, less tidal breaking, a different history of day length, less axial stability, altered climate rhythms, different biological schedules, a darker, moonless sky with no lunar phases and no eclipses. Some of these outcomes are strongly supported by basic physics and orbital dynamics. Others are plausible but more uncertain, especially when they reach into prebiotic chemistry or the detailed path of life's evolution. That distinction matters because the goal is not to turn the moon into a magical necessity. The goal is to see clearly how many parts of Earth's story it has touched, and once imagined absent, the moon becomes easier to understand as present. It is easier to grasp the value of a stabilizer by removing it, easier to understand the power of a tide by weakening it, easier to feel the importance of a recurring lunar signal by picturing a world in which no such signal exists. In that sense, a moonless Earth works as a kind of scientific silhouette. By taking the moon away, the shape of its influence becomes easier to see. Earth would still be a planet without it, but it would not be quite this planet. The daily world of coasts, time, climate, ecology, and sky would all bear the marks of a different history. The moon has not done everything, but it has done enough that its absence would leave gaps across physics, geology, biology, and perception alike. For something often treated as background scenery, that is an extraordinary amount of involvement. If Earth without a moon helps reveal how much the moon matters, the next question is obvious. Why does Earth have this moon at all? That is not a trivial question, because the moon is unusual. It is large compared with Earth, especially when Earth is compared with the other rocky planets. Mars has 2 tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos, both so small and irregular that they look more like captured rubble than grand planetary companions. Mercury and Venus have no moons at all. Earth, by contrast, has a satellite about 1/4 of its own diameter. That is an enormous companion by rocky planet standards, and much of the moon's long-term influence depends on that fact. A small moon would not do the same job. A distant fragment would not raise the same tides, slow Earth's spin in the same way, or help stabilize Earth's tilt so effectively. The moon matters partly because it is not just any moon. It is a large one. So the story of the moon's influence is also a story about its origin. The Earth-Moon pair did not have to exist in this form. The moon's control over tides, time, climate stability, coastlines, and living rhythms depends on the way this particular system came to be. The leading explanation is called the giant impact hypothesis. It is the most widely accepted account of the moon's formation, and it begins with a very early Earth and a violent collision. In this scenario, a young proto-Earth was struck by another large rocky body, often referred to as Theia. The name comes from Greek mythology, which is perhaps a little more graceful than calling it something like extremely bad afternoon number 1. The collision was not a gentle bump. It was a catastrophic event on a planetary scale. Material from the outer parts of Earth and from Theia was blasted into orbit, forming a hot disk of debris around the young planet. Over time, that debris gathered together and formed the moon. This idea became dominant not because it is dramatic, though it certainly is, but because it helps explain several features of the Earth-Moon system at once. It explains why the moon is relatively large compared with Earth. It explains why the moon is poor in some volatile substances that would have been easily lost in a hot, violent formation process. It also helps account for the angular momentum of the Earth-Moon system, meaning the particular combination of Earth's spin and the moon's orbit that had to arise somehow. Most importantly, the giant impact hypothesis fits well with evidence from modern lunar science and geochemistry. One of the strongest reasons the idea became so influential is isotopic evidence. Atoms of the same element can come in slightly different forms, called isotopes, and the relative abundances of these isotopes often serve as chemical fingerprints of origin and history. Samples returned from the moon by the Apollo missions allowed scientists to compare lunar rocks directly with terrestrial materials. Those comparisons revealed striking similarities between Earth and Moon in several isotopic systems. That is exactly the kind of thing one would expect if the Moon formed out of material closely related to Earth's outer layers, rather than forming independently somewhere else and being captured later. The Apollo samples therefore changed the story profoundly. Before that, several lunar origin ideas competed more openly. Some suggested the Moon formed elsewhere and was later captured by Earth. Others imagined Earth and Moon forming together side by side from the same region of the early solar nebula. Still others proposed that the Moon somehow spun off from a rapidly rotating young Earth. Each of these ideas had certain appealing features, but they also struggled with important physical and chemical constraints. The giant impact hypothesis, refined over time by planetary scientists comparing lunar and terrestrial composition, eventually emerged as the most convincing overall explanation. That does not mean every detail is settled. Science is rarely that tidy, especially in planetary origin stories. Researchers continue to model different impact angles, different sizes for Theia, different degrees of mixing, and different post-impact thermal histories. There are still active discussions about how exactly the Moon acquired its present composition and orbital relationship, but the broad picture remains strong. A giant collision in the early solar system seems to be the event that gave Earth its unusually large moon, and that matters enormously for everything that came later. Without that collision, Earth might have had no large moon at all, or it might have ended up with something much smaller, less influential, and far less capable of shaping tides, slowing rotation, or stabilizing axial tilt. The Moon's present control is not some universal feature that every Earth-like planet automatically receives as part of the standard package. It is the consequence of a specific formation history, one involving violence, chance, and the peculiar mechanics of planetary assembly in the early solar system. That is worth pausing over, because it changes the emotional shape of the whole story. The Moon is easy to treat as inevitable because it has always been there for every human who ever lived. It feels built in. It feels permanent, almost constitutional, but it was not guaranteed. The Earth-Moon pair is the outcome of a particular ancient event. The Moon's power over this planet depends on that improbable beginning. It also helps explain why the earlier thought experiment, the version of Earth without a moon, is not merely fantasy. Such planets exist in effect already. Mercury and Venus manage perfectly well without large moons. Mars manages with two tiny ones that do not do for it what the Moon does for Earth. A world without a large stabilizing moon is not absurd. It is common. Earth's situation is the unusual one, and because it is unusual, the Moon's influence becomes even more striking. Its large size relative to Earth gives it leverage across deep time. It can raise substantial tides. It can apply meaningful tidal friction. It can take part in the long exchange of angular momentum that slows Earth's spin and pushes the Moon outward. It can influence Earth's precession strongly enough to help stabilize axial tilt. A much smaller moon would not have the same reach. A moon much farther away would not either. The Moon had to be both large enough and close enough, and those conditions trace back to its origin. There is something almost paradoxical in this. One of the calmest-looking objects in the sky may owe its existence to one of the most violent events in Earth's history. The pale disk that now glides quietly through the night likely began in fire, impact, molten debris, and orbital chaos. But from that violence emerged a long partnership that has helped shape oceans, days, climates, coastlines, and parts of biology for billions of years. Catastrophe gave rise to stability. The collision that might sound like destruction became the beginning of one of the most important relationships in Earth's story. That is why the Moon's origin matters so much. It is not a separate prologue tucked away from the main narrative. It is the foundation of the main narrative. The tides, the slowing of Earth's spin, the stabilizing effect on tilt, the stronger early tides, the long ecological and climatic consequences, all of it depends on the fact that Earth ended up with this moon rather than none at all, or rather than some smaller and less consequential satellite. So the moon's control over Earth is not only a matter of gravity acting now, it is the long afterlife of an ancient event. A large moon exists because a young Earth collided with another world, and the consequences of that collision have been unfolding ever since. The moon did not simply arrive, it was made. And because it was made this way, Earth became the kind of planet that could be shaped by it so deeply. By now the moon no longer looks quite so simple. It began as the familiar cause of the tides, the quiet answer many people learn early and then rarely revisit. The sea rises because the moon pulls on it. The sea falls because the pull changes, useful, accurate, and nowhere near enough. Once the story is followed with a little more patience, that neat coastal fact unfolds into something much larger. The moon does not merely lift water along shorelines. It reaches into the structure, motion, timing, and environmental history of the planet itself. That is why it makes sense to think of the moon not as a passive satellite, but as Earth's quiet partner. Not an equal partner in mass, certainly, and not a controlling master of everything that happens here. The moon does not run the atmosphere, invent the continents, dictate evolution line by line, or personally organize every storm that annoys a holiday. Restraint matters here. A scientific account has to be honest about scale. Earth is shaped by many forces at once, including the sun, the atmosphere, the oceans, plate tectonics, internal heat, chemistry, biology, and the complex interactions among them. But within that crowded system, the moon has a real and measurable role in several important processes, and those processes are not minor decorations. They help define the texture of the world. The most obvious of those processes is tidal force. Because the moon's gravity acts more strongly on the near side of Earth than on the far side, it stretches the planet slightly and raises tides. That is the beginning of the story, but only the beginning. Tidal force acts not just on the oceans, but on the solid Earth as well. Rock flexes, however, slightly. The ground itself rises and falls in response to the same uneven pull that moves the sea. The moon, in other words, acts on the whole planet. Once the oceans are involved, tidal friction enters the picture. The tidal bulges do not sit perfectly beneath the moon, because Earth rotates faster than the moon orbits. Those bulges are dragged slightly ahead, and that offset allows a gravitational torque to develop. Through tidal friction and angular momentum transfer, Earth gradually gives up some of its rotational motion, while the moon gains orbital energy. That exchange slows Earth's spin and pushes the moon farther away. These are not isolated curiosities. They are linked parts of one long, dynamical relationship. That means the moon has helped shape the length of the day. It is difficult to overstate how strange that really is. Day length feels basic, almost beyond history, and yet the record of tidal rhythmites, fossil growth bands, and modern lunar, laser ranging all point toward the same conclusion. Earth once spun faster, days were shorter. The moon, through the long calm work of tidal friction, has helped slow the turning of the planet over geological time. Morning and evening arrive on a schedule partly shaped by lunar history. Then there is axial stabilization, which may be one of the moon's most profound influences. Earth's tilt, or obliquity, is crucial for the seasons. The moon helps stabilize that tilt over long timescales by influencing the precession of Earth's axis. Without a large moon, Earth's obliquity might have varied more strongly, and with it the long-term distribution of sunlight across the planet. The moon does not create the seasons, but it appears to help keep the seasonal framework more stable than it might otherwise have been. That is not a theatrical effect, it is a structural one, part of the deeper architecture of climate. From there, the story moves outward into coastlines and ecosystems. Tidal rhythms shape mudflats, estuaries, salt marshes, mangroves, and intertidal zones. Tidal flushing moves nutrients, oxygen, sediments, larvae, and organic material through coastal systems. The moon is not merely making water go in and out for the aesthetic value of damp rocks. It helps create habitats. It helps maintain productive edges of the planet where land and sea continually exchange material, energy, and life. And then the story becomes even more intimate, because living systems start to follow lunar timing themselves. Coral spawning, semi-lunar rhythms, circa-lunar timing, larval release, beach-spawning fish, intertidal feeding patterns, and other biological behaviours all reveal that the moon is not just shaping environments from the outside. In some cases, it has become part of the schedule within which organisms live. Lunar biological rhythms are not universal, but where they occur, they show something remarkable. Gravity and light have been translated into behaviour. Moonlight adds another layer. It is far dimmer than sunlight, but to animals adapted to darkness, it can still function as meaningful information. Predators, prey, seabirds, reef organisms, and nocturnal animals may all respond to changes in lunar illumination. Here, the moon's influence is gentler and more species-specific than its tidal effects, but it remains real. The moon can act not only through force but through signal. It changes what the night means. Even eclipses belong in this broader portrait. They do not shape climate or coastlines, but they reveal the geometry of the Earth-Moon-Sun system in a direct and unforgettable way. Alignment, orbital inclination, the line of nodes, and the unusual size-distance coincidence that allows total solar eclipses from Earth all remind us that the moon's role is not only mechanical but also perceptual. It structures part of how this planet experiences its sky. And none of this was inevitable. The moon's ability to matter so much depends on the way it formed. The giant impact hypothesis, with the young Earth colliding with Theia and producing a large satellite from orbital debris, explains why Earth ended up with such an unusually large moon for a rocky planet. That size matters. A much smaller moon would not have raised the same tides, transferred the same angular momentum, or stabilized Earth's tilt so effectively. The moon's influence is therefore the long consequence of a specific formation history, not a generic feature every Earth-like planet automatically receives. That is why imagining Earth without the moon is so useful. The thought experiment reveals the outline of its influence: weaker tides, different coastlines, slower change in day length, less axial stability, altered biological timing, a different sky. Earth without the moon would still be a planet, but not quite this planet. That difference is the shape of the moon's importance, and yet, for all of that, the moon remains quiet. It does not roar like a volcano or blaze like the sun. It does not arrive with weather or shatter the ground beneath ordinary feet. Its way of shaping Earth is slower, steadier, and often easier to miss. It works through repetition, through gravitational persistence, through cycles that become history when given enough time. Tidal force, tidal friction, angular momentum transfer, axial stabilization, coastal restructuring, and lunar biological rhythms all belong to that same patient mode of influence. The moon keeps doing the same kinds of things, and over millions and billions of years those things become planetary facts. That is the emotional truth inside the title. The moon controls more than tides, not because it dominates Earth in some grand dramatic way, but because it participates in enough deep processes to leave its mark almost everywhere the story has looked. In the length of the day, in the steadiness of the seasons, in the structure of the coasts, in the rhythm of some living systems, in the geometry of the sky, in the environmental background against which life has unfolded. The moon has not written Earth's entire story, but it has edited several important chapters. And perhaps that is the most surprising part of all. Something so serene, so familiar, and so often reduced to scenery turns out to have been deeply involved all along. The pale body that rises over seas, cities, forests and sleeping houses has been doing far more than lighting the night. It has been helping shape the kind of world beneath that light. The moon's most obvious influence is the tide, and even that is remarkable enough. But the tide is only the visible beginning of a much larger story. Once the surface is peeled back, the moon becomes something far more than a bright object in the night sky. It helps shape the oceans, the slowing rotation of Earth, the long-term stability of the planet's tilt, the structure of coastal environments, and even some of the rhythms by which living things feed, spawn, migrate, and emerge. That is what makes the moon so quietly extraordinary. It does not control everything. It does not govern the whole planet alone. But it is measurably involved in several systems that matter deeply. Through tidal force, it moves the sea and even flexes the solid Earth. Through tidal friction and angular momentum transfer, it has helped slow the turning of the planet while drifting outward itself over immense spans of time. Through its role in axial stabilization, it has likely helped keep Earth's long seasonal framework steadier than it might otherwise have been. Those may be the most surprising parts of all. The day has not always been this long. The moon is slowly moving farther away. The posture of Earth in space has been steadied, at least in part, by the presence of this unusually large companion. None of that is obvious when looking up at it. The moon appears calm, silent, almost decorative, and yet the evidence shows that it has been physically and biologically consequential for billions of years. So the familiar pale shape above the horizon turns out to be something more like a quiet partner in Earth's story. Not dramatic, not loud, just patient. One of the most ordinary sights in the sky has helped shape the conditions under which coasts formed, climates persisted, days lengthened, and life found its rhythms. The moon does more than shine on this world. It has helped make this world what it is,